Eddard Stark stood in the sept at the Red Keep, swallowing down a wave of mingled dread and resignation. The final petals of late summer sunlight glimmered through narrow windows, catching dust motes that spun and danced in the air. Thick pillars of marble rose along the walls, their fluted edges glistening in gold candlelight. The floor under his boots felt cold, even through the thick leather soles, and somewhere in the distance, he caught the rustle of movement from lords and ladies assembled to witness what many would call the most unexpected match in all the Seven Kingdoms. He could still taste the breath of steel on his lips, a reminder of the war that had ended only moons before. Robert's rebellion had concluded in fire and blood, toppling the Targaryen dynasty that had reigned for nearly 3 centuries. Rhaegar Targaryen was slain on the Trident, the Mad King burned on the Iron Throne, and Robert Baratheon now wore the crown that had once belonged to the Dragon Kings. Ned had returned from the war battered in spirit. He had lost friends. He had lost a sister he adored. Lyanna's death had wrapped him in a cloak of grief that he feared would never be lifted. But the demands of the realm prevailed. Robert needed alliances, a demonstration of unity that would bind powerful houses to the new crown. And so, in the swirl of deals and sudden changes that so often followed the end of a war, a match had been proposed that even Ned had found inconceivable at first. He, Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, Lord of Winterfell by the tragic passing of his elder brother Brandon, would wed Cersei Lannister, daughter of Tywin Lannister, the powerful Lord of Casterly Rock and Shield of Lannisport. Tywin's gold and cunning had helped secure the final victory, as Lord Tywin's armies had arrived in King's Landing late but in great force, seizing the city and presenting the heads of the last Targaryen loyalists to Robert. As a reward, and to ensure Tywin remained steadfastly close, the new King Robert had looked upon the Lannisters with favor. Yet the proposed union with Robert himself had been dashed when it became clear that the boisterous, unpredictable Baratheon had loved only one woman, Lyanna Stark, and that love ended with her death. Rumor claimed Tywin had once hoped to wed Cersei to the Prince Rhaegar himself, but fate had intervened. Another path opened, and so Ned, who had been betrothed to Catelyn Tully in an arrangement to strengthen the ties between the North and the Riverlands, found that destiny had shifted beneath his feet. The Tully alliance had become complicated, the arrangements undone in the swirl of new politics. It was said that even Lord Hoster Tully recognized the kingdom's need for a lasting peace, and so, with great reluctance, set aside the contract to allow Ned's marriage to proceed with a different, more strategically urgent bride. Ned recalled the hours he had spent brooding over the decision, each moment weighed by duty and longing for the quiet of the North. If Robert had not insisted, perhaps Ned would have refused. But the realm was raw with the aftermath of war. The new king needed to appear strong and united, with the great houses standing firmly behind him. The wedding, as Robert insisted, would prove that the Lannisters of the West and the Starks of the North were loyal to the throne and loyal to each other. It was a matter of politics, and Ned had never truly wished for politics in his life. Yet there he stood, in the sept, clad in finely woven garments of dark gray trimmed with silver. The direwolf of House Stark was embroidered on his left breast. Across from him, clad in Lannister red and gold, was Cersei, tall, fair-haired, her green eyes flashing with as much resentment as anything else. At the center of the sept, the High Septon raised his hands. In that moment, Ned felt the entire court's gaze prickle upon his skin. He allowed himself a single glance at Robert, who waited near the front with folded arms. The new king had a broad grin on his bearded face, though his eyes seemed sad when he caught Ned's glance. Robert had lost the woman he truly loved, and perhaps that love had become part of the reason Ned now stood ready to wed a woman he barely knew. Across from Robert stood Tywin Lannister, imposing in his stoic calm. His presence radiated cold command. The gold in Tywin's hair had begun to recede just slightly from the temples, and faint lines etched his face, but those lion-like eyes were bright with ambition, forever calculating. Then, quietly, the High Septon began the words of binding. Ned's stomach tightened. Each pronouncement, in the name of the father, the mother, the warrior, the smith, the maiden, the crone, and the stranger, made the vow of marriage feel final, heavier than any sword he'd ever lifted in war. He looked upon the woman who would be his wife. It was no small thing marrying a Lannister, especially this Lannister. She possessed a rare beauty, though it was a beauty akin to a polished sword or a lion's snarl, stunning, dangerous, and cold. He watched her lips press together when she spoke her vow, something in her gaze flickering between fury and resignation. She had wanted to be queen, or so rumor said. This was not the path she had intended. Yet before the eyes of gods and men, the vows were sealed. When she lifted her gaze to meet his, Ned murmured words that bound them in matrimony, quietly, but with all the solemnity of a man who believed in duty as deeply as he believed in honor. Then he slipped a ring upon her finger, a band of silver set with small stones shaped like dire wolves and lions intertwined. They shared a chaste kiss, barely a brush of lips. Ned tasted the faint tang of wine on her mouth. That was enough to signal to those gathered that the union was done. The sept rang with polite applause and cheers. Ned straightened, aware that a swirl of speculation likely danced behind every pair of eyes in attendance. He glimpsed the black-haired figure of Stannis Baratheon among the crowd, his face a mask of stone, and Renly Baratheon, more vibrant, a half-smile hovering on his lips. Closer to the front, the Lannister siblings, Jaime and Tyrion, had taken places near Tywin. Jaime's expression was impassive, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Tyrion watched with a clever grin, possibly sensing all manner of scandal and future intrigue in this unexpected alliance. As the ceremony ended, the lords and ladies of the court dispersed to celebrate in the grand hall. Trestle tables had been erected, groaning with fresh bread, roasted boar, crusted fish from Blackwater Bay, sweet summer wine in crystal goblets, honeyed fruits from the Reach, and other sumptuous dishes designed to show that King Robert's reign would be a prosperous one. The wedding feast was as grand as Robert himself might have made it, the new king determined to overshadow any gloom that lingered from the last battles. Ned found himself briefly separated from his new wife, as lords came to congratulate him. So many faces, so many courtesies to exchange. Lord Arryn, the new hand of the king and the man who had fostered both Ned and Robert. Lord Varys, the master of whisperers, who offered a sweet, unctuous smile. Peter Baelish, who had some sardonic witticism about improbable unions forging improbable alliances, and so on. Yet after the final toast in honor of House Stark and House Lannister, after music soared from a small troupe of minstrels, after their cups of wine were drained, Ned slipped away to find Cersei seated at the high table, her gaze flicking from one attendee to the next. It was a subtle dance of courtly grace and hidden impatience. When she looked at him, her green eyes were cool as emeralds. He sat beside her. For a moment, there were no words. They were husband and wife, yet they knew next to nothing of each other. The tension between them was thicker than the perfumed air. Cersei sipped her wine. Ned could not help but notice the proud tilt of her chin, a stance that revealed her inner defiance. At last he spoke quietly, "My lady wife." She turned her head, hair catching the torchlight. "My lord husband," she responded with a small dryness that Ned thought might be a faint attempt at humor or perhaps bitterness. She paused, letting her eyes roam over him. "I suppose we should attempt to speak like a man and a wife. Yet I am not entirely sure what words to use." Ned studied her face. "We can speak plainly," he said. "I do not pretend to understand you, or to think that you've ever wished to be here. But it is done." She inhaled slowly. "Yes," she said with finality. "It is done. We should not pretend it's anything other than a marriage of convenience. But still, we are bound before gods and men, Eddard Stark. We must try to find a life in it." He nodded. The sadness in her tone surprised him. He had expected only bitterness. For a heartbeat, he recalled Lyanna's last moments, recalled the hush of the Tower of Joy. His sister was gone, the betrothal to Catelyn Tully lost, all for the sake of forging a tie that Robert insisted would keep the realm stable. "It may be that we can find some measure of peace," he said gently, "for both our houses." Cersei's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Then she lifted her wine again, turning her gaze to the throng of revelers, to Jaime in polished Kingsguard armor, to their father Tywin, regal as ever, speaking with Robert about matters of finance or war. She turned again to Ned and gave a faint nod. Then let us hope we do not kill one another before the year is out." Her words were shaped like a jest, though there was little warmth in them. Ned found no ready reply. He suspected that, with this woman, trust would never come easily. And so, with that unspoken tension, they both rose to rejoin the swirl of dancers and well-wishers, pretending for the benefit of the court that all was as it should be. The night wore on, the feast ended, and at last, they were escorted to their shared chamber. The wedding bed in the Red Keep's guest wing was lavishly decorated with furs and silks. Anxious tradition demanded that courtiers escort them to the door, jabbering and laughing, plying them with more wine. But Ned had insisted on a certain quiet. By the time he and Cersei were alone, the torches had burned low and only a few candles flickered. The hush felt awkward in a way that nearly made Ned wish for the chaos of the battlefield. He removed his outer garments and boots in silence. She slipped out of her gown, unfastening the intricate knots with a steady pride that told him she felt no need for shyness. She turned to face him, the candlelight dancing over her bare shoulders. He was briefly struck by the sight of her. She was indeed beautiful, but the coldness in her eyes reminded him that beauty could be a blade. The consummation was brief, a mere ritual to fulfill the vow. There was a fierceness in her, almost a desperation. When it was over, she lay beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Ned stared at the shadows that the candlelight cast on the stone walls. He felt the weight of duty press upon him, as though he were an actor in a performance not meant for him. When dawn broke, they rose. A new life began. In the days that followed, they remained in King's Landing. Robert had yet to name all his counselors, and there were 100 matters requiring the presence of the realm's great lords. Ned longed for the north. He had left Winterfell under the watchful care of trusted bannermen, but he recognized his duty. To Robert, to the crown, to the peace they had all fought so hard to secure. The city was loud and hot, the stench of the gutters rising at midday, the markets bustling with those who had survived the war and those who had grown rich in its shadow. Along the street of steel, blacksmiths hammered swords for a realm supposedly at peace, while whores called out to goldcloaks outside taverns. Ned often felt he could barely breathe. He had grown up at the Vale, sure, but his heart was in the north, in the crisp winter air, under the branches of the weirwood trees. Cersei, by contrast, seemed to flourish here. King's Landing might not have been the seat of House Lannister, but it was a place of intrigue, a place of courtly politics that she navigated with casual ease. Every day, she appeared in the throne room in her red and gold gowns, consulting with Queen Dowager Lisa Arryn, though the older woman had no real role beyond being Robert's mother figure from the Vale. Cersei learned the labyrinthine corridors of the Red Keep, establishing a presence at small gatherings. Within a fortnight, she had become a fixture of the court, admired by some, envied by others, but always the center of whispers. Ned found himself meeting with counselors at Robert's side. Lord Arryn, now the Hand, guided them through the complexities of reconstruction. They spoke of how to deal with the Targaryen loyalists who had fled, how to replenish the realm's coffers, how to ensure trade resumed with Essos. Tywin Lannister often loomed in these sessions, adding his baritone voice with imperious suggestions that benefited House Lannister more often than not. Ned measured his words carefully. He had grown up under the mentorship of Jon Arryn, yes, but Robert insisted that Ned's voice was needed to balance Tywin's. More than once, Ned found himself in quiet disagreement with Tywin, especially regarding punishments for those lords who had initially stayed loyal to the Targaryens. Tywin argued for harsh retribution to ensure no further rebellions. Ned countered that forging alliances with houses in the Crownlands and Stormlands required leniency. More than once, Cersei found a private moment to stand by Ned's side while he was lost in thought. She would observe him with that unreadable gaze. "You are so eager to forgive," she said once, her tone bordering on mocking. "Do you not worry that your kindness will be taken for weakness?" He straightened, turning to her. "Mercy is not always weakness. When the realm has bled, it's time to mend." She tilted her head. "Spoken like a northerner. Let us hope the realm sees it the same way. But do not forget, my lord husband, that the next war can rise from the seeds of the last, if we fail to be strong. Then she left him to mull her words. Their marriage, it seemed, existed in a realm of forced politeness. They shared a bed dutifully, if without tenderness. Yet their days were largely separate. He learned, in time, that Cersei possessed an acid wit. She never openly insulted him, but she would watch him with those cat-like eyes, as though searching for a chink in his armor. On the nights they did speak at length, the conversations revolved around the daily struggles at court. She demanded to know his opinions of the lords who paraded through King's Landing, their intentions, their secrets. She probed him for any sign of what might be said behind closed doors. At times, Ned felt as though she were an interrogator instead of a wife, seeking every scrap of information. In turn, she gave him little. About her family, about herself, she was guarded. She praised Jaime's newfound position in the Kingsguard with a certain pride, as though no day had passed since he earned the white cloak. But whenever Ned sought to ask about her youth, or about Tywin's plans, she would deflect, a faint smirk on her lips. And yet, in tiny moments, he saw glimpses of a woman who had dreamed of a different life. Once, he found her in the gardens near the keep's walls, standing amidst the lemon trees. The wind teased strands of her golden hair. When she turned, he saw an expression in her eyes that looked almost wistful. Then it was gone in an instant, replaced by practiced poise. "Do you need something, Lord Stark?" she said, cool as glass. Ned hesitated, only to ask if you are well. She stared at him in silence for a moment before replying, "I am perfectly well, husband." With that, she brushed past him, trailing the scent of rose oil behind her. The first sign that the union might bear fruit arrived several moons later, in the form of rumors. Servants whispered that the Lady Cersei had felt ill in the mornings, that her appetite had shifted. At first, Ned dismissed such talk as the normal flights of fancy among servants, but then he noticed for himself. She grew more guarded, more subdued in the mornings, only to re-emerge in the afternoon with a determined front. At last, she summoned him to her solar. He found her there, pacing, her hands pressed over her flat stomach. She told him the news without flourish. She had missed her cycle. A maester had confirmed she was with child. Ned felt a curious swirl of emotions at the announcement. Apprehension, a flicker of relief that the marriage might gain the acceptance of the realm, even a shadow of sadness as he thought of the child that might have been his with another wife, if only fate had not led him to this path. But duty was duty. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then we must give thanks to the gods," he said, voice measured. "We will ensure you have the best of care." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. "Yes," she murmured. "We should. This child will be of House Stark and House Lannister. The realm will watch him, or her, closely." She slid out from under his hand, approaching the window. "We will be tied now, truly, and I will be mother to a child of the north." He studied her form. The golden sunlight framed her hair in a halo. "It doesn't matter that the child will have the blood of the north and the west," he said quietly. "What matters is that we do our duty by them." She nodded once, her face inscrutable. "Duty," she echoed, as though it were a foreign word. As the months passed, King's Landing was abuzz with the gossip of Lady Cersei's pregnancy. Tywin Lannister appeared more satisfied, if only by a fraction. Robert roared with joy at the notion that his closest friend would father a future lord or lady, a child that would further secure the new regime. The small council, too, seemed to relax, as the union had produced tangible results. Ned could sense that this event had bound him more tightly to the crown. He received word from Winterfell that many of the northern lords expressed cautious approval, trusting that a Stark in the Red Keep meant the north would have the king's ear. Ned wondered if any truly understood the complexities of his position. Meanwhile, Cersei showed her pregnancy with stoic dignity. She insisted on attending feasts, though she drank only watered wine. She was seldom far from her twin brother, Jaime, or from the handmaidens who helped her with matters of comfort. Ned, for his part, remained vigilant, ensuring she had no cause to complain of neglect. But it was clear that they were still near strangers. One evening, when she was well into her 4th month, he found her in their chamber, turned away from the mirror. She was running a brush through her hair. In the reflection of polished metal, he saw her eyes flick toward him before she spoke. "I do not like this room," she said abruptly. Ned paused, then removed his cloak, draping it over a nearby chair. "Would you prefer different accommodations?" he asked. She inhaled slowly. "It's so barren, stark and cold. You keep the windows open, even in the evenings. I feel a chill in my bones that I fear will never leave me. Sometimes I wonder if it's the North calling to you, or if you simply do not want me here." Ned's brow furrowed. "I hadn't realized you were uncomfortable. I thought you might appreciate the fresh air. King's Landing can be stifling." A half-smile tugged at her mouth, though it did not reach her eyes. Yes, it can." She set the brush aside and turned to face him. Her belly showed the faint swell of pregnancy, and Ned felt a pang of responsibility. "I suppose it doesn't matter," she said, voice softening slightly. "What's done is done." He stepped closer. He wanted to express some measure of sympathy, or at least understanding. They had both been thrust into a union that served greater powers. He thought to speak, but words failed him. Instead, he gently took her hand, pressing it between his own. For a moment, she allowed it, her eyes on his. He felt a flicker of something pass between them, perhaps the faintest sense of solidarity in their shared predicament. She pulled away, though not harshly. "We should sleep," she said. "Another day of courtiers awaits us tomorrow." He inclined his head. Yes, sleep. Though they lay beside each other, their bodies brushed only by chance. Ned closed his eyes, listening to her soft breathing in the dark. He wondered if this was how the rest of his life would unfold. Two partners locked in a semblance of alliance, never quite bridging the gap between them. Duty, but no warmth. In the weeks that followed, the realm continued to rumble with changes. Robert, the newly minted king of the 7 kingdoms, was no subtle ruler. He embarked on lavish hunts, feasted with lords who swore renewed fealty, and made a show of dispensing coin for rebuilding towns ravaged by the war. He drank deep and sang bawdy songs late into the night with his knights and oldest friends. Ned was at his side more often than not, sharing in none of the boisterous joy but maintaining a stoic presence. There were times, though, when Robert would dismiss the others and corner Ned in a small courtyard or a quiet corridor. "How does your lioness fare?" Robert asked one morning, a grin playing on his bearded face. "She's a sight more comely than most women at court, that's for certain. She's certainly turned men's heads, though she's your wife, so they'll keep a wide berth, or taste the flat of your sword." Ned's expression was neutral, though he felt a hint of discomfort. "She is well. She carries the child without much trouble, aside from the morning sickness. I hope it passes soon." Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll have your heir soon enough, Ned, if the gods are good. And by the gods, you deserve it after all we've been through. I never thought I'd see the day you'd marry a Lannister, though." His tone grew softer. "Times change, my friend. The war changed all of us." Ned looked away, memories of a tower in the mountains, of Lyanna's final breaths. "Yes," he said, a shadow in his voice. "We have to live in the world we have, not the one we wished for." Robert nodded solemnly, then forced a roguish grin. "Well, the world we have is one where I'm king, you're wed to the lioness, and we've done away with the Targaryens. Not so bad, eh?" The grin faded briefly, replaced by a flicker of guilt. Then it was gone, replaced once more by the boisterous mask he wore so easily. "You'll come join the hunt with me soon, I hope. These southern boars are no match for us." Ned gave a reluctant nod. "Perhaps." In the meantime, rumors flitted about. Some wondered if Tywin Lannister, father of the queen consort who might have been, was truly pleased to see his daughter wed to a Stark. Others whispered that the continued presence of Jaime Lannister in King's Landing was more than mere devotion to the Kingsguard. Tyrion, too, kept an eye on all that transpired, the imp moving through feasts and sessions with a sardonic smile, a half-empty cup of wine always close at hand. Months passed, The child within Cersei grew. Ned did his best to see that maesters and healers tended to her, though she needed little from him in that regard. She was strong-willed, seldom complaining of aches or pains, even as her belly swelled and her ankles swelled with it. The court took delight in speculating whether the child would have the golden hair of the Lannisters or the dark hair of the Starks, or if it might be a union of both. When the birth came, it was at the height of a relentless summer, a time when King's Landing simmered under an unforgiving sun and the waters of Blackwater Bay seemed almost stagnant in the heat. Ned stood outside the birthing chamber with clenched hands while the midwives and maester scurried inside. He heard Cersei's cries, sharper than any blade. Each shout ripped through him with guilt and helplessness. Robert had come to wait with him initially but retreated when the tension grew. Jaime Lannister was nowhere to be seen, reportedly riding with the city watch to quell a disturbance by Flea Bottom. Tywin was away in the west, tending to matters at Casterly Rock. At last, a wailing cry pierced the air. "A boy," the midwife called out in excited tones. Ned exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Moments later, a servant beckoned him inside. The birthing chamber reeked of blood and sweat, a pungent swirl of life and pain. Cersei lay back on the bed, her hair matted to her forehead, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes blazed with fierce energy. In the arms of a midwife lay a small infant, red-faced and crying, his voice loud in the hush. Ned approached slowly. The midwife placed the boy in his arms. He felt a swell of strange emotion course through him, an odd mixture of fatherly pride, confusion, and a distant longing he could not fully name. The boy's tuft of hair was dark, almost black, though birth hair could sometimes change. He had strong lungs, wailing as though outraged to be in this new world. Cersei stirred, lifting her head. Her eyes found Ned and the boy. She said nothing, only watched intently. Then, with deliberate care, Ned moved to her side, placing the child gently in her arms. He saw how she stiffened slightly, as though uncertain how to cradle this tiny being. But her hand came up, guiding the child to her breast. Ned sank to one knee beside the bed, watching mother and son. "He's strong," he said at last, his voice thick. She said nothing for a long moment. She gazed down at the infant, brushing a soft fingertip along his cheek. Then she said, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, "He is ours." Ned nodded. "Yes," he murmured, and for an instant, he thought he saw something like softness in her face, but it vanished behind her usual guarded expression. They named the boy Jonel, after Ned's grandfather, a common Stark name that carried weight in Winterfell. Cersei accepted the name with a slight nod. She did not seem to care about tradition as much as the power the child might represent. But the court accepted it, and soon the entire city was celebrating the arrival of Lord Eddard Stark's heir, scion of the North and the West. King Robert proclaimed a tournament in the child's honor, though the summer heat made jousting in heavy armor a test of more than skill. Within a few moons, it was decided that Ned and Cersei would journey north to Winterfell, so that the newborn heir could receive the blessings of the old gods in the Godswood, as well as the new. Tywin Lannister approved. It was important, he said, for the realm to see that the union between the houses was more than a political convenience. And Robert was eager to see the North again, or so he claimed. In truth, the capital was beginning to chafe at him, and he was restless for change of scenery. Thus, a grand procession was formed, one that snaked out of the Red Keep's gates with 100 wagons, knights in shining armor, and servants carrying every comfort for the royals. Ned, Cersei, and their infant son rode beneath banners of the Baratheon stag, the Stark direwolf, and the Lannister lion. It was a sight that people would recall for years, a demonstration of the new realm, forged after the rebellion, marching forth in all its pomp and splendor. The journey took many weeks. At each major town or castle, lords and ladies turned out to welcome the party, to kneel before their new king, to see the child of House Stark and House Lannister. Cersei's cool composure never wavered, though Ned sensed her discomfort as the entourage moved further and further from the climate of the south. By the time they crossed the neck, the air had grown brisk, the sky more often filled with gray clouds. Jonal was fussier in the colder weather, despite being wrapped in furs. Cersei clutched him protectively, huddling near braziers at night. Yet for all her outward complaints about the North's chill, she doted on the child, ensuring the wet nurse was close at all times, refusing to let Jonal suffer. Ned, though not a man prone to open affection, found himself warmed by her motherly vigilance. At times, he would glimpse the faint ember of tenderness she kept hidden beneath layers of pride. When at last the party neared Winterfell, Ned felt a stirring deep in his chest, an ache of both relief and sorrow. Memories flooded him of the day he left for the Vale as a boy, the day he returned to bury his father and brother after Aerys Targaryen's cruelty, and the day the war had pulled him south again. Now he was coming back, not with the Tully bride that had once been promised, but with a Lannister wife and a child in swaddling clothes. The gates opened, and the watchers on the walls called out greetings. Winterfell's courtyard filled with the bustle of the king's men, the wagon train, and the curious onlookers among the castle's inhabitants. The direwolf banners stirred in a cold wind that carried the promise of an early autumn. Cersei gazed upon the ancient fortress with a thin-lipped expression. "So," she said quietly to Ned as they passed through the gates on horseback, "this is the seat of House Stark. It's gray." He nodded. "Winterfell is a place of ancient strength. It might not be as grand as the Red Keep, but it has kept my people safe for thousands of years." She raised an eyebrow. "One can see the years in every stone, every crack. A place of ghosts and memories, I suspect." Ned let the comment pass. He dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. Courtiers flocked around the Queen's wheelhouse, assisting Robert out, while others tended to Cersei as she descended with Jonal in her arms. The boy squirmed, wide-eyed at the new surroundings. Roderick Castle, the master-at-arms, bowed deeply, as did the steward Vayen Poole. Familiar faces from Ned's childhood seemed to blur together. He greeted them with solemn courtesy. Then, in the great hall, warmth spread from roaring hearths, banishing the northern chill. Servants rushed to prepare a welcoming feast, though more modest than the extravagant affairs at King's Landing. In the corridor leading to the Stark family's private quarters, Ned stood with Cersei and their retinue. He indicated the heavy doors of oak and iron. "These are our chambers," he said. "I had them prepared to ensure they're warm. Let me show you." They entered to find a suite with thick stone walls, lined with tapestries depicting wolves running through snowy forests. A hearth had been lit, throwing flickers of light across the furs laid on the floor. Cersei surveyed it all with a certain scrutiny. "Better than I feared," she said at last, moving to the cradle that had been placed near the fire. She carefully laid Jonal inside, fussing over the blankets until they were properly tucked. Then she turned to Ned. "So, do we present the child to these old gods of yours?" He gave a curt nod. "Yes, if you're willing. It's tradition for a Stark's child to be blessed in the godswood. The heart tree stands as it has for centuries. But I won't force you." She watched him for a moment, her eyes calculating. "If it must be done, it must be done. I will see to it. I would not have our son denied whatever your traditions might grant him." There was a quiet in the room. Ned realized with some surprise that this moment might be the closest they had come to mutual respect. She was a proud Lannister, but she was also a mother, willing to step into the old ways for the sake of her child. That evening, while Robert was off carousing with some of the northern lords who joined them on the journey, Ned led Cersei to the godswood. The castle's heartwood was a place of deep stillness, ancient trees with rustling leaves that whispered in the wind. The heart tree itself rose in the center, its bark white as bone, its leaves the color of blood. The carved face in the trunk watched them with eyes that seemed to drip red sap like tears. A hush fell over them as they approached. Cersei cradled Jonal in her arms, glancing around warily. "This place feels—" She did not finish her sentence. Ned knew what she meant. The old gods had no temples of stone, only these silent groves. He knelt near the heart tree, resting a hand on the trunk. Then, in a soft voice, he spoke the words of thanks and prayer passed down by countless generations of Starks. He asked the old gods to watch over his son, to give him the strength of the north, the fortitude to endure. Cersei stood by, listening. Jonel gurgled, reaching out a tiny hand. The bark of the weirwood tree loomed above them, ancient in its quiet witness. When Ned finished, he glanced up at his wife. She shifted her stance, as though uncertain. Then she knelt, albeit stiffly, bringing Jonel closer to the tree. The child stared in baby wonder, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Cersei pressed a small kiss to his brow. "May you be strong," she whispered, her voice echoing in the hush. "May you never kneel to any force that would harm you." Ned's breath caught at the quiet fervor in her words. He realized that whatever else might be between them, she would not be half-hearted in protecting her son. In that moment, amid the hush of the godswood, a flicker of understanding passed between them. They both wanted the child safe, wanted him to thrive. Duty and pride might have forged their marriage, but this child was no mere political arrangement. Winterfell adjusted to the presence of the king's party. Robert Baratheon reveled in the North's hospitality, feasting every night, hunting in the surrounding forests with local lords eager to impress. Cersei endured the cold with as much grace as she could muster. At times, Ned would find her in the library tower or walking along the battlements, swathed in thick cloaks, quietly observing her new surroundings. If any part of her missed King's Landing, she did not say so aloud, though she would occasionally remark on the lack of excitement in the north. Jonel, for his part, seemed to flourish in the crisp air. The wet nurse fussed over him constantly, remarking that he was strong for his age, that his grip was tight, and that he had already begun to show the bright sparkle of curiosity in his eyes. Ned found himself drawn to the boy, despite his usual reserve. Late in the evenings, after dealing with the responsibilities of hosting Robert and overseeing matters of the North, he would find Cersei in the solar, rocking the child to sleep. Sometimes, Ned would sit beside her in silence until she placed Jonel in his crib. On rare occasions, she would let Ned hold him while she looked on, her eyes guarded yet distant. Then, as the weeks turned into months, the king's grand visit had to end. Robert could not remain in Winterfell forever. He had a realm to govern, however haphazardly, and the small council was calling him back south to address matters of state. Yet Ned faced his own question. Would he remain in the north, as was his right and desire, or return to King's Landing to serve as a royal counselor? Robert pressed him to come south, but Ned felt the pull of his ancestral seat. In the end, a compromise was reached. Ned would remain at Winterfell through the winter, or until the realm stabilized, then return to court once matters in the north were in order. Cersei, however, was insistent. "I go where the seat of power is," she said. "I am not meant to sit in this cold fortress while the realm revolves around King's Landing." A tension arose between them. Ned wished for his family to stay with him, but he also understood that Cersei's nature was not suited to the quiet of Winterfell. And if Robert demanded that the Queen's sister-in-law, the wife of the Warden of the North, be near the seat of power, it was not easily refused. Besides, Tywin Lannister surely expected it. He would not have his daughter languish in a northern keep while decisions that shaped the realm were made in the Red Keep. In the end, an arrangement formed. Cersei would travel south with Robert's retinue, along with the infant Jonel. Ned would follow after he dealt with key matters in the north. It was not ideal, but it seemed the most practical. Yet the night before the king was to depart, Ned found Cersei pacing in their chamber. The torches cast tall shadows on the walls. Jonel slept in the cradle, oblivious to the tension. Cersei turned to Ned, her voice low. "You will let me take him, won't you?" Ned felt a pang in his chest. "He is my son as well," he said. "I do not want to be parted from him, but I cannot leave Winterfell yet. The lords of the north require direction after all the upheaval. If you're determined to return to King's Landing, then Jonel will need his mother." She tilted her chin, her expression flashing with challenge. "I will not leave him here if that's what you wish. I do not trust that your bannermen would see him as anything other than a child of two conflicting worlds." Ned hesitated, A part of him wanted to keep his son here, in the safety of the north, where his forefathers had ruled for centuries. But he also knew that might be a recipe for even greater strife, and Cersei would never allow it without a battle of wills. "No," he said at last. "He will go with you. I only ask that you keep him safe." Her lips quirked in a mirthless smile. "I will do whatever I must to protect our son," she said, voice hard. "No matter the cost." Ned believed her. He glanced at Jonal, sleeping peacefully in the cradle. "I will come as soon as I can." She inclined her head, and for a moment, they shared a mutual understanding. They would part, but the child was a bridge between them, a reason for them to remain bound beyond mere formalities. The next day, the courtyard was filled with the sounds of farewells. Robert bellowed at Ned to hurry along to King's Landing, enumerating the many revels they would share once he arrived. Knights mounted their horses. Wagons creaked under heavy loads. Cersei stood near her wheelhouse, holding Jonal. She wore a thick cloak of gold and crimson, but her face was impassive. Ned approached. They said their goodbyes quietly. He touched his son's cheek, marveling at how small he was. Then, in a move that surprised even himself, he kissed Cersei's brow. A brief gesture, an unspoken promise. She flinched slightly, but did not draw away. Then the retinue departed, and Ned stood on the walls of Winterfell, watching as the banners receded south along the King's Road. Only when they vanished entirely did he turn away, feeling a hollowness in his chest. He told himself he would ride south soon, that the child would not even be old enough to notice his absence. But a disquiet haunted him all the same, as though he were losing something precious in that moment. Winter came in earnest. Though the great snows did not arrive yet, the days grew shorter, the winds sharper. Ned threw himself into his duties. He met with the northern lords who grumbled about new taxes. He held court for disputes among lesser houses. He oversaw the training of young men in the yard, forging the next generation of knights and soldiers for House Stark. Through it all, he thought of the child, and of the woman who carried him away. He received letters, of course, some penned by Maester Pycelle in King's Landing, others with the Lannister seal. They informed him that Jonal was thriving, that the king's court was as tumultuous as ever, that Tywin had traveled to the capital to advise the king, or so the letters claimed. But nothing from Cersei directly, save for a formal note that said the child had his first tooth. No mention of her personal state, no mention of her own feelings. Time moved slowly in the cold. When at last the realm stabilized enough for Ned to consider heading south, winter's snows threatened to block the passes. Advisors urged him to wait, to let the worst of the cold pass. He acquiesced, frustrated but aware that traveling in deep winter across the neck could be dangerous, especially if the roads iced over. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming. The child, it seemed, now had begun to crawl. Then, a few moons later, the child took his first wobbly steps, aided by handmaidens. Cersei did not write of it in her own hand, but the news reached Ned nonetheless. He felt a pang of sorrow at having missed those small moments. Then came the letter that would finally force Ned's hand. It arrived by Raven, sealed in gold. The message within was from Jaime Lannister, of all people. It was curt and formal, addressed to Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. He requested the presence of Lord Stark at King's Landing urgently. There were matters of the court that demanded Ned's immediate attention, and more importantly, there were tensions regarding the lineage of House Lannister's child with House Stark that required resolution. The language was vague, but it reeked of intrigue. Worried, Ned resolved to brave the winter roads. He took a company of loyal men, including Ser Roderick Castle, and began the arduous trek south. The journey was fraught with frozen rivers and swirling snow, but eventually, as they drew nearer to the southern regions, the weather softened. By the time they reached the outskirts of King's Landing, spring seemed to be making its first cautious approach. They entered the city to find it as noisy and filthy as Ned remembered, though the snows had left mud in the streets, making the approach to the Red Keep a slog. The gold cloaks parted to let them through the gates. Ned dismounted in the yard, stiff from weeks of travel, his breath puffing in the milder southern air. A steward hurried forward to greet him. "Lord Stark, welcome," he said, bowing. "The Queen pardon, Lord Tywin. Well, the king demands your presence in the throne room at once." Ned frowned. The steward seemed flustered, uncertain whose name to invoke first. "Very well," Ned said. He unbuckled his sword belt, handing the blade to a retainer. Then he marched toward the great hall, where the Iron Throne loomed beneath stained glass windows. When the doors opened, Ned strode into an atmosphere thick with tension. Courtiers lined the walls, some looking on with interest, others with discomfort. Robert was perched on the Iron Throne, one leg slung over an armrest in a posture of angry impatience. Tywin Lannister stood to one side, silent as a statue carved from granite. Jaime Lannister stood behind the throne in his white cloak, face set in stoic resolve. Nearby, Ned noticed the Master of Whisperers, Varys, hands clasped, expression unreadable. Peter Baelish lingered as well, tapping a finger on his lips as though savoring the drama. But Ned's gaze was drawn to the figure at the base of the throne steps. Cersei. She wore a gown of scarlet and gold, her hair swept back, and she held Jonel by the hand. The boy was nearly 2 years old now, hair a messy tumble of dark brown, wide green eyes peering at the throng of onlookers. Cersei's face was pale but composed. Robert's voice boomed across the hall. "Ned, at last you're here. We've waited far too long. I'm tired of this nonsense, but certain accusations have been made. We need them put to rest." Ned's heart pounded. He glanced at Cersei, who met his gaze with an icy stare. "Accusations?" he asked. Tywin stepped forward, his tone measured. "Your son, my Lord Stark. There are those who say, he may not be yours." A hush fell over the hall. Ned felt a surge of anger at the implication. He turned sharply to face Tywin. "What is the meaning of this?" Jaime, from behind the throne, spoke coolly. "People will gossip, Lord Stark. Questions arise about the boy's parentage. Some observe that he does not resemble you strongly enough. Others claim he bears a certain resemblance to someone else." Ned's gaze flicked to Cersei. She stood rigid, her hand on Jonel's shoulder now, as though to shield him from the words. "This is absurd," Ned growled. "He's my son. I will not have him slandered." Robert's voice thundered. I'd believe you, Ned, but these rumors have a life of their own. They spread like wildfire, and I'd stamp them out if I could, but they've reached my ears too many times. We must put an end to it." Tywin's eyes were cold, fixed on Ned. "We must be certain. A bastard in line for Winterfell and, by extension, a potential seat of power could cause chaos. The realm needs clarity." Ned clenched his fists. "The realm has all the clarity it requires. Jonel is my son, born in wedlock. I have the wedding vow, the testimony of the Septon who bound us. I have the witness of the maester who attended the birth." A muscle ticked in Tywin's jaw. "So you say, but rumors speak of a closeness between my daughter and my son, Jaime." A stunned silence followed. Ned's mind reeled. He had heard the faintest whisper of Cersei's closeness with Jaime once or twice, but had dismissed it as vile rumor. To have Tywin himself bring it to the fore was beyond belief. Jaime stood as straight as a sword, his jaw taut, but he did not speak. Ned turned to Cersei, searching her eyes. She lifted her chin, lips parted in angry defiance, but said nothing. Jonel clung to her leg, sensing the tension. Robert exhaled heavily. "Gods be good. I don't want to believe any of this, but Tywin insists it must be addressed. He won't have the name Lannister tarnished by these rumors if they're false, and if they're true," he grimaced. "I hardly know what to do with that. Incest is a crime against gods and men." Ned's stomach churned, yet he forced his voice to be steady. "It's a monstrous accusation. My wife would never, with her own brother." Cersei found her words at last. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "I have never dishonored my vows. Jonel is Eddard Stark's son. Anyone who suggests otherwise shall answer for it." She glared at her father, defiance blazing in her eyes. "Even you, father, if you doubt me." Tywin's expression was carved from stone. "Then let us prove it." He turned to the side, gesturing to a maester who hovered near the wall. The man stepped forward hesitantly, carrying scrolls and small vials. "We have learned ways, crude though they may be, to determine lineage. The color of the hair, certain traits, lines of inheritance. House Baratheon is known for stamping its seed with strong black hair. House Lannister typically bears golden hair. House Stark, brown to black. The boy's hair is brown with hints of gold. Enough to raise these whispers. I want them silenced." The suggestion was that the child might be fathered by Jaime, who had golden hair, while Cersei had golden hair, producing a child with some mixture. But Ned's was dark. Ned felt a wave of revulsion. "No test is needed. He is my son." Jaime spoke up, startling the crowd. "Let the test be done, Lord Stark. If it puts an end to these whispers, it's best for all. Don't you agree?" He looked directly at Ned, his gaze a challenge. Ned stared at the Kingsguard knight. "You know the truth. Do you question it?" Jaime's lips tightened. "I question everything that tarnishes the honor of my sister. If some test can prove the boy is yours, why refuse?" Ned wanted to spit at the man's feet, but he forced himself to remain calm. He felt the eyes of the court upon him, saw Robert waiting, frowning, saw Peter Baelish's slight smirk. He wondered if he was being cornered into some fiasco. Glancing at Cersei, he saw a flicker of fear, carefully masked. Perhaps she did not trust this so-called test to be free from Lannister manipulation. Or perhaps she knew something, but Ned shook the dark thoughts from his mind. He refused to believe in such monstrous rumors. He stepped forward. "Do your test," he said to the maester. "And when it proves Jonal is mine, I expect the realm will hear the truth and put these rumors to rest." The maester bowed, clearly uncomfortable with being at the center of such drama. He approached Cersei, who allowed him to take a small snippet of the boy's hair with trembling hands. Jonal began to cry, startled. Ned's heart clenched. The maester then timidly asked for a snippet of Ned's hair, and Ned allowed it. Jaime Lannister offered a lock of his own hair as well, surprising the courtiers. Then the maester began to speak of lineages, the color of hair, the science that some had begun to practice in the Citadel. The entire affair felt humiliating and intrusive, with courtiers craning their necks to observe. Ned tried to comfort the crying Jonal, but Cersei kept a tight hold on the boy, her face a mask of fury. At last, the maester looked up from his notes, sweat beading on his brow. There is no conclusive sign that the child is fathered by Ser Jaime, my lord. His coloring is not wholly unexpected from a union between Lord Eddard and Lady Cersei. While it is true that House Lannister's golden hair often breeds true, it is not guaranteed. Lady Cersei's mother, after all, came from House Marbrand, which sometimes carries more chestnut hues. This child's hair and features align more with the darker side of his maternal ancestry than with Ser Jaime's coloring. And his eyes. The maester peered nervously at the dais. They are quite green, yes, but many have green eyes. There is no direct sign that he is not Lord Stark's son. Tywin's face was unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw flexed. Is that certain? The maester swallowed. As certain as any mortal can be, given the knowledge we possess. If I must give a final conclusion, yes, the boy is likely Lord Eddard's. The chance of other parentage seems negligible. Robert sighed, relief washing over him. Gods be good. Let that be an end to it. He looked at Tywin. Well, Lord Tywin, we have our answer. The boy is Ned's. Let no one speak otherwise. Tywin inclined his head, though his eyes shone with a peculiar tension. Very well, your grace. The matter is resolved. Ned exhaled slowly, but he could feel the undertow of what had just happened. A crack in the alliance, a public accusation that would not be easily forgotten. Jaime, too, seemed dissatisfied, though he masked it behind the stoicism of a Kingsguard. Cersei stood with Jonal in her arms, stiff as a statue carved from ice. Ned stepped forward, holding out his hands. She relinquished the boy to him slowly. Jonel, still whimpering, buried his face against Ned's chest. Ned whispered a soft reassurance, glaring at Tywin as though to say, "You have tormented my child enough." With that, Robert dismissed the court. The crowd dispersed in whispers. Ned cradled Jonel while Cersei followed him out of the throne room in silence, her skirts sweeping the floor. Once outside, she turned to him, fury rippling beneath her features. "You see what my father is capable of?" she hissed, keeping her voice low. "He would humiliate me, cast doubt on his own blood, all for the sake of ensuring no scandal touches House Lannister." Ned's own anger burned bright. "He humiliated more than you. He insulted me and my son." She gave a bitter laugh. "Did you think he would not do the same to you? He has no love for you, Ned Stark. He only tolerates you because Robert demands it. My father is a man who sees alliances as currency, not as bonds of affection." Ned looked away, swallowing a retort. He realized Cersei was not wrong. "Then we must ensure Jonel is not caught in the middle again. He's only a child, not a piece on Tywin's board." She studied his face, some of her anger melting into a quieter resolve. "Agreed," she said at last. "But that will require us to be watchful. My father will not relent in his ambitions. We must protect our son from all angles, even those that come from within our own houses." Ned nodded gravely. "Yes, we will." There was a moment's silence, broken only by Jonel's small sniffle. Then Cersei asked, in a softer voice than he had heard from her in a long while, "Will you hold him for a while longer? He is calmer with you." Ned blinked, somewhat startled, then nodded. "Yes, of course." He adjusted the child in his arms, murmuring a reassurance. As he did, Cersei reached out, her hand brushing Jonel's cheek, then resting briefly on Ned's arm. It was not a gesture of love, but perhaps it was a gesture of truce. In the days that followed, the court pretended the incident never happened. Rumors, of course, still lingered in the corridors, but no one dared speak them aloud. Tywin maintained a courteous demeanor whenever Ned was present, though Ned could sense the frigid distance between them. Jaime avoided Ned entirely, while Tyrion observed everything with sardonic amusement. Robert, too relieved that a scandal had been averted, turned back to his feasting and hunting, though occasionally he would cast Ned an apologetic look as if to say, "I'm sorry for the trouble, friend, but this is our life now." Cersei, for her part, behaved with glacial composure at official functions. But behind closed doors, she seemed newly protective of Jonel, seldom letting him stray far from her sight. She tolerated Ned's presence more often, allowing him to spend time with the boy without bristling. On more than one occasion, Ned joined them in the royal gardens, where Jonel toddled clumsily after butterflies, enthralled by the flowers that still clung to color in the southern climate. Cersei would watch Ned carefully, as though trying to decode his intentions, but she no longer seemed eager to push him away. And in those quiet, ephemeral moments, Ned allowed himself to hope that perhaps their marriage might become more than a political bond. He did not love her, nor she him, but they shared a child, and that was no small thing. Perhaps, with time, they could protect him from the ravenous ambitions of the court, from the looming shadows of House Lannister and the burdens of House Stark. Perhaps they could forge a new path, one where Jonel grew up knowing both winter's steel and summer's subtlety. A child who might one day be strong enough to rule in whichever seat he claimed, be it Winterfell or some place in the crown's domain. But the Game of Thrones was as vast and dangerous as the ocean, its currents swirling in unpredictable eddies. Ned sensed this every time he caught the guarded expression on Tywin's face, every time Varys or Littlefinger hovered in the background with their polite smiles and hidden agendas. The realm had endured a rebellion, yes, but new plots always hatched in the dark corners of power. Jonel, as a child of two great houses, might be a unifying symbol or a coveted pawn. Still, Ned resolved that come what may, he would see his son safe, and Cersei, whatever her secrets, had the same resolve. It was a fragile alliance between them, but it was real. In a place where truth was elusive and alliances shifted like desert sands, that fragile alliance might be all they had. So they carried on, day by day, forging something that was neither love nor simple obligation, but a complex tapestry of necessity, shared duty, and the occasional spark of grudging respect. They might never be a couple who laughed freely in each other's arms, but in the hush of night, when Jonel slept in his cradle, they found a measure of stillness side by side, each protecting the child from the realm's creeping shadows. And in the end, that might be enough to reshape the destiny that had once seemed etched in stone, showing that even in a land built upon war and secrets, unlikely marriages could yield new possibilities, for good or ill, in the grand, unending tapestry of Westeros. Ned Stark rose before dawn, slipping quietly from the bed so as not to wake the small figure who slept beside him. Jonel had taken to climbing into his father's bed of late, especially when the nights were stormy or when a strange dream troubled him. He was old enough to speak in halting phrases, 2.5 years by the turning of the new year, and while he had a nurse all his own, the boy had grown attached to the sober, steady presence of his father. Cersei, for her part, did not discourage it when Ned was in King's Landing. She seemed pleased when Jonel chose to stay with his father now and then, as if that closeness bound them more firmly into a household worth defending. Their married life remained an uneasy dance of caution, but when it came to protecting Jonel, they often found accord. The Red Keep's corridors were dim, torchlight casting flickers against thick walls. It was the hour of ghosts, some said, when half the castle still slept, and sometimes Ned could almost fancy the shape of lost souls drifting through the gloom. The shades of Targaryens who had died in the sack of King's Landing. The spirit of Brandon Stark, who had never stepped foot here but whose memory lay heavily on Ned's heart, and the countless unnamed who had perished in the war or in the secret passages beneath the keep. He tried not to dwell on such notions, for they served no purpose but to deepen his melancholy. And in truth, Ned had grown accustomed to this new life. He still chafed at the intrigues, but he would never shrink from duty. He crossed the courtyard, greeting a guardsman who bowed stiffly, then descended a flight of steps to the low yard where practice dummies stood. The master-at-arms here was an older knight named Ser Aaron Santagar, who oversaw the training of young squires and city recruits. Ned seldom liked to practice sword work when he was in the capital. His duties often left him too little time, but this morning the restless swirl of his thoughts needed an outlet. He shed his heavy cloak and took up a blunted practice blade. The crispness of the early air reminded him faintly of the north, though the capital could never truly mimic the biting clarity of Winterfell's dawn. When he began his drills, the sword swooshed with each stroke, cutting arcs in the gloom. The motions brought him a sense of calm, an old rhythm from the days of his youth at the Eyrie. He lost himself in the repetition until footsteps announced someone's arrival. Looking up, he spied Ser Aaron approaching with a mixture of courtesy and curiosity. The knight inclined his head. "My Lord Stark, you rise early." Ned nodded, lowering the practice sword. "Old habit. Morning is the best hour for a clear mind." Ser Aaron gestured toward a rack of practice weapons. "Shall we spar a round or two if it pleases you? I've some squires who might learn from your style." Ned considered for a moment. "If it's no trouble." Soon enough, a pair of bleary-eyed squires had been roused from their chambers to watch. Ser Aaron and Ned faced each other on the compacted dirt, each armed with blunted steel. The first clash rang out like an echo in the hush of dawn. Ned found himself moving with an ease that belied his years, parrying and riposting with a steadiness honed by war and discipline. Ser Aaron was skilled. He had served in a dozen smaller conflicts before Robert's rebellion, but Ned forced him back step by step. The watchers murmured quietly, though Ned paid them little mind. In the final exchange, Ned thrust, pivoted, and smacked the flat O. His blade against Ser Aaron's shoulder, disarming the older knight with a single smooth motion. Ser Aaron raised his hands in polite surrender. "Well struck, Lord Stark," he said, breathing heavily. "Even as I expected." Ned offered a small bow of respect. "Thank you, Ser Aaron." A trio of younger men in the yard clapped politely, though they seemed as reluctant to draw attention to themselves as any half-awake squires might be. Ned returned the practice sword to its rack. By now, the sky had brightened, the first edges of the sun cresting the horizon. He thanked the master-at-arms, then withdrew to wash away the sweat and prepare for the day's business. He ascended back to the royal living quarters, where a handful of servants already bustled about, lighting fires and hearths, setting out bread and cheese for breaking fast. Pausing at a window, Ned gazed at the sprawling city below. King's Landing never truly slept, and even at dawn, the winding streets were dotted with early carts heading for market. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, drifting over the muddle of rooftops. The air smelled faintly of brine from the Blackwater, though the stench of the city's waste was never far behind. In the distance, banners draped from the Iron Gate, proclaiming the realm's unity under Robert Baratheon. Yet Ned was not naive. Unity was fragile, and old wounds from the rebellion could still fester. He stepped into his chambers to find Jonel awake, perched on the edge of the bed, playing with a carved wooden direwolf that one of Ned's northern knights had gifted him. The child's hair was a tousled dark brown that sometimes, in direct sunlight, carried a faint auburn glint, some ancestral Lannister or Marbrand trait, perhaps. His eyes were a piercing green, more striking than Ned's own gray. When Jonel saw Ned, he grinned, letting out a breathless, "Papa!" The boy's voice was that of a toddler, only just mastering phrases, but the delight in his tone was clear. Ned bent down and ruffled the child's hair, smiling faintly. "Good morrow, little wolf." Jonel reached out and grabbed Ned's wrist, looking up with a bright curiosity that never failed to stir a pang in Ned's chest. He was old enough to sense that the Red Keep was not truly his home, not the way Winterfell was, yet too young to understand the complexities of politics that shaped his life. Sometimes Ned wondered if Jonel felt torn between two worlds, even at this tender age. But the boy never seemed upset, so long as he had his mother's presence, his father's visits, and the amusements of the court. Ned scooped him up, ignoring the slight protest from the wet nurse, who hovered nearby as though worried Ned might drop him. "He's hungry, my lord," the nurse said in a careful tone. She was a plump woman from the Westerlands, chosen by Cersei for her loyalty. "Shall I take him down to breakfast?" Ned nodded. I'll join you shortly." Then he paused, glancing around. "Where is Lady Cersei?" "She asked not to be disturbed this morning," the nurse answered. "I believe she's reading in her solar. Should I fetch her, my lord?" "No, that's all right." Ned set Jonel on his feet, smoothing the child's tunic. "Take him to the breakfast hall, and I'll see if her ladyship wishes to join us." With a stiff bow, the nurse led Jonel away, the boy hopping along the corridor with the carved direwolf clutched under one arm. Ned watched them go, then made for Cersei's solar. She had claimed an airy corner of the Red Keep, with tall windows that overlooked the sea. Even early in the day, the room was often warmed by sunlight, a vantage from which she could survey ships entering the harbor. He found her exactly as the nurse described. Seated by a window, a slim book in her hands, an untouched goblet of watered wine by her elbow. She wore a gown of emerald and gold, simple but elegant. Her golden hair was twisted in a single tail that fell over one shoulder. When she heard him approach, she did not look up from the page. He paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to speak. At length, she closed the book and flicked her green eyes to him. "Good morning, husband." There was a gentleness in her voice that did not quite match the guarded expression in her gaze. "Good morning," he replied quietly. "Jonel's gone to breakfast. Will you join us?" She set the book on a small table, smoothing her skirts. "I will in a moment. I needed a bit of quiet. Too many courtiers playing the same old games. I wanted time to read." She nodded to the title on the cover. Ned recognized it as a volume on the great houses of Westeros, penned by some maester decades prior. "The histories can be dull, but they remind me of how little changes in these halls." Ned studied her face. There was a tension there, though not directed at him. "We have council sessions today," he said gently. "Robert will want us both there. Lord Tywin is making another push for certain readjustments to the realm's finances." Cersei exhaled, her eyes flickering. "My father," she murmured, as if the name tasted bitter. He can't bear that the crown's coffers are ever less than flush. If he had his way, we'd all be put on austerity. Meanwhile, Robert's hunts and tournaments keep draining gold like water through a sieve. Ned refrained from comment. Robert's extravagances had grown more flamboyant in recent years. He was still a young king, not yet in his mid-30s, and prone to the same boisterous loves. Feasting, hunting, drinking, women, that had colored his youth. Yet Ned had grown worried at the mounting debts. Tywin, as the realm's wealthiest lord, had extended loans to the crown more than once, ensuring House Lannister's leverage remained powerful. When Ned said nothing, Cersei shrugged and rose from her seat. "Very well, let us go to breakfast. Then we can endure the council. No doubt my father and your friend Lord Arryn will find some compromise to keep the realm afloat for another few moons." Her voice carried a bite of sarcasm, but she steadied herself quickly. "Come, Ned." She took his offered arm without hesitation, an act that would have surprised him a year ago, back when their marriage was little more than a brittle facade. They still had no true tenderness between them, yet they had learned how to move in harmony before the court. Whether out of duty or out of a mutual desire to shield Jonel from scandal, they presented a united front as the Warden of the North and the Lady from the Westerlands. They emerged into the corridors, passing a few courtiers who bowed or curtsied. Ned caught glimpses of hushed conversation in the corners, some watching them with that perpetual curiosity that accompanied any highborn marriage. But no one dared speak openly of the near scandal that Tywin himself had once raised about Jonel's paternity. Those rumors had mostly died, replaced by new whispers of other intrigues. In King's Landing, old gossip was seldom the coin of the realm for long. Fresh rumors always arose to feed the appetites of the board. They stepped into the smaller dining hall, a room with pillars of polished marble and a vaulted ceiling. At the table, Jonel sat on a padded high seat, grinning as the nurse tried to coax him into taking bites of bread with honey. He seemed delighted when he saw his mother arrive, reaching out tiny hands. "Mama!" Cersei offered him a reserved smile, leaning in to brush a small kiss on his forehead. "Good morning, my little lion wolf. Are you tormenting your poor nurse already?" The nurse dropped a curtsy. "He's been well, my lady, just a bit energetic." Jonel promptly banged his spoon on the table for emphasis. Ned settled in beside his son, and Cersei took a seat on the boy's other side. A servant poured fresh water and offered platters of fruit, cheese, and stewed eggs. As they ate, Ned observed how Jonel babbled about the carved direwolf he'd brought to the table, and how he occasionally pointed to the red and gold embroidered lion on Cersei's sleeve. The child recognized both symbols, though he did not yet grasp the significance. It struck Ned how truly blended the boy was. The Lion of Lannister, the Wolf of Stark. In simpler times, that might be a sign of unity for the realm. In a place like King's Landing, it was more likely to be used as leverage by those who played the Game of Thrones. The meal passed in relative peace, with only a handful of lesser lords drifting in to take their breakfast at a respectful distance, eyeing the royal table in case the king might appear. But Robert had long since taken to sleeping late, so the watchers soon turned their attention elsewhere. After Jonel had eaten his fill, mostly honeyed bread and mashed fruit, Cersei signaled the nurse to take him for a short walk in the castle gardens. Ned gave the boy a fond pat on the head. Then the lord and lady of this uneasy alliance set off for the council chambers. They found Robert already in conversation with Lord Arryn, the hand of the king, who looked somewhat strained. Tywin Lannister stood near them, dressed in his usual somber finery, gold thread glinting at his collar. Other members of the small council were filtering in. Peter Baelish, the master of coin, with a knowing smirk and a series of polite bows. Varys, the master of whisperers, gliding in with his soft slippers, and Stannis Baratheon, master of ships, frowning as usual, his mouth set like a knife's edge. Renly Baratheon, master of laws, was absent that morning, likely still abed or out chasing some new amusement. Ned and Cersei took their seats. Robert was halfway through a complaint about the cost of refurbishing the royal fleet. "Why should we keep building new dramens if there's no war? The seas are calm, our coasts secure. The Ironborn have shown no inclination to rebel again. Not after we crushed them in the final battles of the rebellion. We've no Targaryens to fight, at least none worth a damn. Let's spend gold on feasts, not ships. Lord Aaron made a gentle but firm gesture. Your Grace, we must be prepared. The realm has endured a civil war, and we must not leave ourselves vulnerable. As master of ships, Lord Stannis has recommended we bolster our naval strength to discourage any would-be rebellion, ironborn, pirates, or otherwise. Stannis inclined his head in a curt nod. A realm that neglects its fleet invites raids, brother. We must maintain at least a minimal standard. Robert grunted, waving a dismissive hand. Fine, but do it as cheaply as possible. We're not made of gold. Tywin, what's the status of the crown's debts? Tywin's calm voice resonated. Growing, Your Grace. The last tournament you hosted. He gave Robert a pointed look. Was costly. We have mercantile obligations to the Iron Bank of Bravos, and House Lannister has extended generous loans as well. We cannot keep spending without limit. Cersei folded her hands in her lap, her face expressionless. Though Ned guessed she was bracing for a clash between father and king. Robert, as expected, reacted with a scowl. You always say that. Should I tax the peasants more? There'd be riots in the streets. Peter Baelish cleared his throat in a mild manner. Perhaps there are other avenues, Your Grace. Smarter tariffs on certain goods, a re-examination of trade routes. We might also adjust some of the interest rates if House Lannister is amenable. He cast a sly glance at Tywin. And if the Iron Bank sees we are making earnest efforts to repay, we might negotiate more favorable terms. Tywin regarded Littlefinger with cold reserve. We shall see. Until then, it would behoove the court to practice some restraint in expenditures. Robert let out a great, gusty sigh. This is why I hate councils. All talk of coin, no talk of sport. Then he flicked his gaze toward Ned. What say you, Ned? You're always the cautious one. Ned, who had been listening intently, said simply, The realm suffered war not so long ago. People still rebuild. We must be careful not to break them further with heavy taxes. Better to find fair ways to raise revenue, perhaps a re-evaluation of tolls on merchant ships entering the Blackwater, or an incentive for ships to dock at the smaller harbors. And if the crown must hold fewer lavish feasts, so be it. The people do not eat on spectacle. Robert grumbled, but not unkindly. You've grown as dull as old Stannis, he said, though his tone suggested a grudging respect. You and your talk of duty. Stannis merely gave a tiny shrug, unoffended. The conversation moved on, touching upon the continuing rumors that Viserys Targaryen and his young sister were wandering the free cities, begging favors from magisters and merchant princes. Robert's face darkened at the mention of the Targaryens. If they ever set foot in my domain, I'll have their heads, he spat. All of them died when we took the city. Those that matter anyway. Let them skulk across the seas. We'll not fear a beggar king. Lord Aaron, more somber, noted that certain lords in the Crownlands remained uneasy about rumored Targaryen loyalists. We do best by maintaining a watchful stance, the Hand said. But there's little reason to panic. We've no evidence the Targaryens have the gold or men to mount an invasion. Tywin nodded in agreement. The Golden Company might be a threat if the exiles gained its favor, but there's no sign that such a contract has been made. They are sellswords, after all. They fight for gold, not empty Targaryen promises. With that matter temporarily laid to rest, the council turned to smaller items. Border disputes, trade negotiations with Pentos, the arrival of an envoy from Dorne. Ned's mind briefly drifted. He recalled how House Martell had lost Prince Elia and her children during the sack, a terrible crime that had fueled Dornish resentment. Even with the rebellion over, Dorne's stance toward the crown was uneasy at best. The envoy's arrival was likely part of an ongoing attempt to smooth tensions. Cersei spoke up only once, when a question arose of whether the king would attend a feast at Lord Rosby's estate, but otherwise she remained composed. Ned recognized that the daily minutiae of rulership bored her. She was far more engaged when it came to maneuvering alliances or ensuring her father's interests were preserved. When the meeting at last concluded, Robert dismissed them with a wave. I'm off to the mews. There's a hawk that's supposedly unmatched in the hunt. Then a ride. And don't pester me with more talk of coin today, or I'll have your tongues. Lord Arryn gave a polite smile. We would never dream of it, your grace. Robert snorted, then ambled out with Stannis following in his wake, the younger Baratheon presumably intending to continue pressing his case for the fleet. Peter Baelish slid away with a respectful bow, and Varys drifted off, humming quietly to himself, no doubt on his way to gather secrets. Ned stepped from his seat, nodding to Lord Arryn. Tywin approached, his gaze flicking from Ned to Cersei. My lord father, Cersei greeted coolly. She did not curtsy, that formality was often omitted in private, but her posture was rigid. Tywin observed them both, one corner of his mouth tightening. I would speak with you, daughter. Lord Stark, I trust you have matters of your own. Ned looked at Cersei, uncertain if she wished him to stay. She gave him a slight shake of the head, so Ned inclined his head to Tywin in a gesture of cordial acknowledgement and withdrew. As he left, he could feel Tywin's eyes on his back, evaluating, calculating. The memory of that day when Tywin demanded proof of Jonal's parentage still lingered in Ned's mind. Their truce was uneasy, built upon mutual necessity. Tywin's ambition could bend or break any arrangement if he deemed it advantageous. And though Ned had no illusions that Tywin cared for Jonal as a grandfather in a gentle sense, House Lannister would not easily relinquish a child who carried their blood. Ned made his way to the lesser courtyard, intending to check on a matter of supplies for the north. He had spent much of the previous winter in Winterfell, trying to ensure his bannermen were satisfied with the new order. But King Robert's demands had dragged him back south again. In truth, part of him was reluctant to leave King's Landing for too long. Jonal's presence here meant Ned could not simply vanish into the north as he might have wished. He had a son, and the child needed him, perhaps needed him even more in the cutthroat environment of the capital. He found that the stablemaster had a series of ledgers detailing shipments of grain from the riverlands that were meant for distribution among the king's garrisons. Ned studied them briefly, verifying that the amounts tallied with the bills. The routine nature of the task settled his nerves somewhat. He had always preferred tangible duties to the intangible swirl of politics. Yet, as he was leaving the stables, he ran into Lord Peter Baelish, who popped up as though from the shadows. Ah, Lord Stark, Baelish said, his voice edged with that perpetual mocking cheer. Diligently checking the grain? One might think you were master of coin, not I. Ned frowned, disliking the man's smug tone. I want to ensure the shipments are accounted for. The North depends on fair trade and distribution. Of course, Baelish replied, clasping his hands behind his back. You are a man of honor, after all. And how is the Lady Cersei these days? She remains quite the figure at court. You two do make a striking pair. Ned's voice went cold. We are husband and wife, Baelish. Is there some implication in your words? Peter gave a disarming chuckle, stepping back a half-pace. No, none at all. I simply admire how you've both managed to navigate the, shall we say, unique challenges of your union. He paused, eyes gleaming. Marriage is no small matter in these halls. I hope it has not weighed on you too heavily. Ned stared at him. If you have a point, speak it plainly. Baelish pressed a hand to his chest, feigning offense. Truly, I have no pointed remark, my lord. Only an observation that the realm is quite interested in such alliances, especially one that merges the proud wolf and the proud lion. Perhaps one day you will expand the brood. Give us more little half-lion, half-wolf cubs roaming the Red Keep. Ned's jaw tightened. That is our concern, not the realm's. Indeed, Baelish said lightly. But I do wonder, the inheritance lines become so fascinating. If, for instance, Jonal eventually inherits Winterfell as your rightful heir, then the North might be quite influenced by his mother's heritage. And if you were to have another child who might claim other rights... Oh, but I speak only in speculation. He gave a little bow. Pray forgive my rambling. A master of coin's mind often wanders to the future, especially regarding new lines of wealth and power. Ned kept his voice level with effort. See that your wandering mind does not lead you into places best left alone. Baelish. Peter's eyes glinted. A friendly piece of advice indeed, my lord. I'll leave you to your day. He dipped in a mocking half-bow and slipped away, seeming pleased with himself. Ned took a slow breath, trying to quell the anger Baelish's comments had stirred. The man delighted in pricking others' vulnerabilities. Yet Ned recognized that behind the jest lay a real question. Would he and Cersei have more children? Their relations were cordial enough, though seldom warm, and there was no sign Cersei was with child again. Perhaps that was by her own design. She had never spoken of wanting more children, nor had Ned pressed the issue, uncertain if it would truly strengthen or complicate their tenuous arrangement. For now they had Jonel, and that was more than enough to tie their houses together in the eyes of the realm. He left the stables in a somber mood. By midday, he had arranged to meet with a few other northern lords who were in the capital, among them Lord Manderley of White Harbor, a heavy-set man whose booming laugh echoed in the great hall. They spoke of shipping lanes, mercantile expansions, and the possibility of building more cogs to carry goods from White Harbor to King's Landing. Any distraction from the swirl of Lannister alliances was welcome to Ned. Yet as he finished the talk, heading back toward the royal apartments, he caught a glimpse of Jaime Lannister strolling the corridor, clad in Kingsguard white with gold inlay. Jaime paused when he saw Ned, a faint sneer tugging at one corner of his mouth. Lord Stark, the Kingsguard knight said in a clipped tone. Staying out of trouble, I trust? Ned forced politeness. Sir Jaime, I hope the day finds you well. Jaime shrugged. Well enough, though I'd prefer if the city offered more excitement. My sword grows dull. His green eyes traveled over Ned's face, as though seeking a reaction. And how is my nephew? Ned stiffened, but he managed to keep his voice neutral. Jonel is in good spirits. He's walked the gardens this morning, or so I'm told. Jaime inclined his head, a glitter in his eyes that might have been amusement, or something darker. My beloved sister keeps him close, does she not? It's good. A mother should dote on her child. We must ensure no harm befalls the little pup. Ned bristled at the slight dig. Jaime had called Jonel a pup, instead of a lion cub or some kinder phrase. Perhaps it was meant to mock. But Ned answered calmly. He's quite safe, and he has both of us to watch over him. Jaime cocked his head. Both of us? My sister and you, or you and I? He let out a short, humorless laugh. I suppose we all have a stake in him in our own way. Sir Jaime, Ned said quietly. If you mean to imply that you... Jaime's hand rose, palm out. Peace, Lord Stark. I mean no specific implication, only that the boy is dear to my sister, and thus I'd see no harm come to him. He is of Lannister blood as well as Stark. That is all I'll say. Ned stared, trying to read Jaime's expression, but the Kingslayer's mask was impenetrable. At length, Jaime gave a slight nod and moved on, his white cloak trailing behind him. Ned stood there, heart pounding. It was a reminder that Jaime and Cersei shared a bond deeper than typical siblings, even if the vile rumors of incest had never proven true. Jaime remained possessive in some sense, protective of his twin. That protective streak apparently extended to the child, though whether from love or from twisted pride, Ned could not guess. He continued onward, eventually finding his way to the open-air terrace that overlooked the Blackwater. The day was turning warmer, the watery sun shining through scattered clouds. He leaned on the balustrade, letting the breeze ruffle his hair, wishing he could be in Winterfell's courtyard instead, beneath the watchful walls that had sheltered his family for generations. But the north was far away. The longer he stayed in King's Landing, the more he realized there could be no simple retreat from the responsibilities laid upon him. When he found Cersei that evening, dining in a smaller chamber with Jonel dozing on her lap, she looked thoughtful, almost subdued. The baby was too big to be curled so easily, but he'd insisted on staying with his mother until he succumbed to sleep. The chamber was lit with candles, and Cersei's face glowed softly in their light. Ned took a chair across from her. He refused to rest in his bed, she remarked wryly, stroking Jonel's hair. I suppose he's had too many new sights today. Ned eyed the sleeping child. He'll outgrow that soon enough. He's growing so fast already. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Cersei brushed a kiss across Jonal's forehead and passed him gently to the nurse, who carried him away to the nursery. Ned and Cersei remained, the candlelight flickering over the remnants of a modest meal of roast duck, bread, and greens. She sipped from a cup of mulled wine, her eyes drifting to Ned. My father informed me he'll be returning to Casterly Rock soon. Ned nodded, not surprised. Has he said why? He claims he has business in the west that demands his attention, some dispute among lesser lords near Lannisport. But I suspect he also wants to assess the gold mines. He's never comfortable unless he knows exactly how much coin is flowing into House Lannister's coffers. Cersei let out a faint sigh. He left me with a final admonition to keep watch on Robert's spending, as though I can sway the king from his feasts and hunts. I told him that's better left to Lord Arryn or Littlefinger, but he expects me to do it nonetheless. Forever the obedient daughter, am I not? Her bitterness was plain. Ned studied her, recalling their earliest days, when she had been all cold pride and resentment at her dashed hopes of being queen to Robert. Yet the war had ended, and here she was, married to Ned, not Robert, leaving her father's grand design for her a broken dream. He wondered if she still bore that old bitterness toward Robert or if new resentments had taken its place. We each serve our roles, Ned said carefully, taking a sip from his own wine. Robert is the king, Jon Arryn is the hand, your father is warden of the West. And you and I are meant to stand together for the sake of peace. Our families are joined by Jonal. Cersei rolled the cup between her hands, gaze lowered. So we are. Sometimes I wonder how things might have been if the Targaryens had remained in power, or if Robert had chosen me as his queen. Would it have been simpler, or far more dangerous? Ned hesitated. The Targaryens would not have treated your father kindly. Aerys had no love for House Lannister, not until your father sacked King's Landing. And Robert, well, his heart was with Lyanna, as we both know. She made a soft sound, not quite a laugh. Yes, he made that clear enough. She lifted her gaze to Ned. But that's all dust and memory now. We have Jonal and we have our vows. That's enough to keep the realm guessing, if nothing else. For a moment, her features eased, and she almost looked weary. Sometimes I envy simpler lives, Eddard Stark. The people who can simply marry and love without a realm to pry into their bedchambers. Ned felt a flicker of sympathy. I do too at times. They lapsed into silence, finishing what remained of the meal. Then Cersei rose, smoothing her gown. I'll to bed. I'm tired tonight. She paused by the door. Will you join me later? He regarded her carefully, trying to read her intent. More often than not, they slept in the same chamber, an arrangement that kept courtiers from gossiping. But they shared physical intimacy rarely, only when some confluence of necessity or fleeting desire overcame their reserve. Yes, he said quietly. I need to see to a letter first, then I'll come. She nodded, turning away. Very well. Good night, husband. Good night, he murmured, though she was already stepping into the hallway, leaving the room hushed behind her. Alone, Ned lingered at the table. A swirl of thoughts pressed upon him. His father's memory, Brandon's tragic death, Lyanna's heartbreak with Rhaegar Targaryen, Robert's illusions, the child he and Cersei had brought into the world. Every turn led back to Jonal, this living symbol of House Stark and House Lannister, a boy whose fate might become the hinge on which future alliances swung. Ned wondered if the tensions would ease as Jonal grew, or if they would only worsen, culminating in fresh disputes over inheritance, loyalty, and power. Yet for all that, Ned resolved one thing clearly in his heart. He would keep Jonal safe, whatever the cost. He rose and went to his study, a small room lined with shelves of scrolls and records. By candlelight, he penned a letter to Winterfell, addressed to Maester Luwin, asking after the management of the castle, the harvest, the condition of the roads. One of his younger cousins, a distant Stark relative named Ser Bernard Stark, served as castellan in his absence, but Ned needed frequent updates. He also asked after the old godswood. Writing brought him a measure of calm. Though he had never been a man of many words, putting quill to parchment reminded him that Winterfell still stood, awaiting his return whenever duty allowed. When he finished, he sealed the letter with the direwolf stamp. Then, with the candle guttering low, he made his way to the bedchamber he shared with Cersei. She was already abed, hair unbound, eyes closed. Soft light from a single brazier flickered across her face, lending her features an almost gentle cast. Ned changed quietly and slipped beneath the covers. Sometimes she feigned sleep to avoid conversation, but tonight she stirred, turning onto her side to regard him. He met her gaze in the dim light, uncertain whether to speak. She spoke first, voice hushed. "Have you noticed the way Lord Baelish looks at us? Like he's counting coins in a coffer. He's up to something, as always." Ned thought back to their encounter that morning. He wonders if we'll have more children, or perhaps how best to benefit from your father's gold. Peter Baelish is always sizing up opportunities. She let out a sound of disgust. "I hate feeling like a piece of a puzzle for men like him to move. That's all I've ever been to my father, too. And now, for the realm, an emblem of an alliance." She glanced away, her hair spilling across the pillow. "I do not regret Jon'el, but I hate that he'll be a piece as well someday. No child should bear that weight." Ned reached out, hesitating, then softly laid a hand on her shoulder. "We can try to spare him from it, at least until he's old enough to choose his own path." Cersei's eyes glistened for a moment, and Ned thought he saw a hint of unshed tears. But then she blinked, and her composure was restored. "Perhaps," she murmured. Though in King's Landing, no one escapes the game forever. They shared a moment of quiet closeness, a fragile sort of comfort that rarely emerged between them. Then she drew away, turning her back. Ned settled onto his pillow, gazing at the carved beams overhead. He listened to her breathing, steady and low, and let his thoughts drift until sleep claimed him. Time passed in the Red Keep, measured by the shuffle of councils, the swirl of banquets, and the comings and goings of lords from every corner of the realm. Jon'el continued to grow, tall for his age, more talkative by the day. He ran about the castle gardens, chasing cats and climbing on statues, often scolded by his nurse or by the master of arms if he strayed too close to the training yards. Yet he possessed a sunny resilience that Ned found both surprising and heartening. He laughed easily, forging a small circle of young companions among the children of other highborn families at court. He had yet to show any real fear of the city's intrigues. For now, King's Landing was simply the place he knew. Cersei, too, found new ways to exert her influence at court. She was not queen, but she was the daughter of Tywin Lannister, and the wife of Ned Stark, who in turn was King Robert's closest friend from the rebellion. With that pedigree, no one dared insult her openly. She often hosted small gatherings of ladies, both those from the Westerlands and others from prominent houses who sought her favor. Gossip was traded over scented teas and honeyed pastries. Occasionally, Cersei would share with Ned the tidbits she thought relevant. Who was betrothed? Who sought an alliance? What rumors might be swirling about the Targaryens or about Robert's rumored bastards in the city's brothels? In those moments, Ned recognized that Cersei was no less skilled than her father in reading the currents of power. She simply channeled that skill in social settings rather than the council chamber. He allowed her that realm, content to focus on more direct governance. Sometimes, he marveled at how their lives had intertwined despite their stark differences in temperament. He was a man of the North, she a woman of the West, and yet they were forging a joint existence under the scorching sun of the capital. One bright morning, Ned found himself summoned to a meeting with Lord Arryn. He discovered the hand pacing near a window in his solar, the older man's brow furrowed. Jon Arryn greeted him with a nod and bade Ned sit. "Thank you for coming so swiftly," the hand began, folding his hands behind his back. He was well into his 50s now, with hair gone mostly gray, but his bearing remained dignified. "I wish to speak with you privately about a delicate matter." Ned leaned forward. "Of course, my lord hand." Arryn took a breath, glancing at the door to ensure it was shut. It concerns the accounts of the master of coin. There have been large sums routed from the treasury to various ends. The king's tours and hunts cost a great deal, yes, and the crown's debts to House Lannister are substantial. But I've discovered other, smaller expenditures that do not appear on the official ledgers. It's as though the coin is being siphoned off for some secret purpose. Peter Baelish claims ignorance, but I suspect he knows more than he lets on. Ned frowned. Do you believe it's mere corruption, or something more ominous? That is what I'm trying to determine, Aaron said, his expression grave. I have no doubt some of it goes to paying hush money for the king's indiscretions, or bribes to keep certain lords pliable. That's common enough at any court. Yet the scale troubles me. There are rumors of gold being funneled into unknown channels. I want to be sure no one is funding a potential uprising or paying off sellswords. The realm needs peace. Ned nodded slowly. How can I help, my lord? I have no great love for rummaging in secret accounts, but if I can lend my eyes or my men— Aaron gave him a thin smile. I appreciate the offer. For now, I'd ask that you keep an ear to the ground. Perhaps speak with some of your bannermen here in the city, or any loyal men in the city watch, to glean if there's unusual activity at the harbors, or if coin is changing hands outside the normal channels. If we discover a threat to the realm, we must act quickly. Ned inclined his head. I will do what I can. He hesitated, then added, Have you spoken to Robert about this? Aaron shook his head, a weary sadness in his eyes. Not yet. The king grows impatient with talk of finances and shadowy conspiracies. He prefers a clear foe on the battlefield. Until I have firmer proof, I'd rather not stir him to rash anger. So let us be discreet. Ned rose, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. I'll keep this close. If anything arises, I will come to you first. Aaron patted Ned's hand. You have my thanks. Take care, Lord Stark. The city is full of watchers, and some may have no love for you or for me. With that ominous note, Ned departed, his mind churning. He resolved to keep his eyes open for any sign of covert dealings. The idea that someone in the court might be funneling gold to a hidden cause was unsettling, but not surprising, given the labyrinth of loyalties that defined King's Landing. He made subtle inquiries among men he trusted, including a few of the northern guards who patrolled the city's streets in rotation with the gold cloaks. They reported that certain shipments from the Vale and even from the Free Cities arrived at off hours, carted swiftly to unknown storehouses. But none could say more without risking suspicion. Ned found himself at a crossroads. If he probed too openly, he might tip off the conspirators. Yet if he did nothing, the matter might fester and grow into something worse. Meanwhile, word reached the court that Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, had begun to grumble about the stifling oversight of the crown on his salt and fish trade. Whispers of renewed Ironborn raids floated through the narrower passages of the Red Keep, though nothing had been confirmed. King Robert brushed aside the rumors, proclaiming that the Greyjoys were no threat. Ned, remembering how fiercely the Ironborn had resisted during the rebellion, was not so sure. Time carried them forward, day by day, until Jonal's fourth name day arrived. A modest feast was held in the capital's main hall, with lords and ladies invited to celebrate the child's growth. Robert, in a jovial mood, insisted on a mock joust. Knights would tilt with blunted lances for the amusement of the crowd, dedicating their passes to the little lion wolf, as he called Jonal. Cersei stood at Ned's side on the dais, wearing a green and gold gown that captured all eyes. Ned could see the pride in her stance, though she maintained an elegant veneer of detachment. Jonal, seated between them, watched the jousting with wide-eyed excitement. He clapped his small hands as horses thundered by, squealing whenever a lance struck a shield. It gladdened Ned to see his son so enthralled by the spectacle, though part of him worried about the day Jonal might want to pick up a sword in earnest. When the joust ended, Robert hoisted the boy onto his broad shoulders, letting Jonal wave to the crowd as they cheered. It was a heartwarming sight, one that gave the impression of a grand, happy family. Yet Ned sensed how carefully orchestrated it was. A demonstration of unity, proof that House Stark, House Baratheon, and House Lannister remained allies for all the realm to see. Even so, Jonal's giggles were genuine, and for a moment, it seemed like all the bitter tensions had melted away. But peace in Westeros seldom lasted. The swirl of politics carried on beneath every pleasant facade. One crisp morning, Ned was summoned by Lord Arryn yet again, this time to the Tower of the Hand. When Ned arrived, the Hand Steward ushered him into a private chamber, then departed, leaving Ned and Arryn alone. Jon Arryn was seated at a heavy oaken desk littered with scrolls, his face creased with worry. "I've uncovered something troubling," Arryn said quietly, gesturing for Ned to sit. "I traced some of the suspicious funds to an organization near the docks, some manner of shipping consortium that does not exist under any official name. It's being used as a funnel. Coin flows in, and from there it disappears." Ned frowned. "Any idea who's behind it?" Arryn drummed his fingers on the desk. "That's the delicate part. My sources imply it may be connected to some supporters of House Targaryen, minor lords or merchants who still harbor loyalty to the exiled dragon. But I've no proof. It could also be Sellswords or something else entirely." A cold weight settled in Ned's stomach. "If it is Targaryen loyalists, we must act. But we should confirm it first, or else we risk rousing Robert into a fury that might burn half the city searching for traitors." Arryn nodded gravely. "Precisely my concern. If Robert hears even a whisper of Targaryen involvement, he'll demand immediate arrests and heads on spikes. And if it turns out to be false, we'll have a massacre for nothing. I need someone I can trust to investigate discreetly. You have men loyal to you, northerners who might slip into those dockside haunts without drawing attention." Ned considered carefully. "I can send a few, yes. Men who are used to traveling quietly, who won't be recognized by Baelish's or Varys's watchers. Let them see what they can find." "Do so," Arryn agreed, "and be sure to keep me informed. If we catch even the smallest thread that leads to a Targaryen infiltration, we must handle it with caution." Ned left the Tower of the Hand with a sense of dread. Though he had fought to depose the Targaryens, he had never felt the burning hatred Robert carried for them. If indeed some hidden network in King's Landing now sought to restore the dragon banners, it would almost certainly end in bloodshed. The realm was still recovering from the last war. Another would tear it apart. That evening, before supper time, Ned took Ser Roderick Castle, his old retainer who had traveled down from the north on a recent supply run, aside. In a quiet antechamber, he explained what he needed. A small group of trustworthy men, skilled enough to move among the dockfolk without raising suspicion, to discover the truth about this secret funnel of coin. Roderick, with his bushy white side whiskers, listened intently, then nodded. "I'll pick 3 or 4 of our best. Men who won't talk. We'll see what we can learn, my lord." "Be careful," Ned said. "If these are Targaryen loyalists, they'll be wary of any newcomers. If they sense a trap, they might flee or lash out." Roderick gave him a reassuring smile. "We'll keep our blades close and our voices quiet." In the days that followed, Ned waited anxiously for word from Roderick's men. He carried on his duties as normal, refusing to show any sign of suspicion. Jonal demanded his father's attention in the afternoons, tugging Ned's hand to come watch him attempt to swing a wooden sword near the practice yard. Cersei offered her usual cool observations, reminding Ned that she was no fool. She sensed something weighed on him, though she did not press. At last, near midnight on a damp, windy night, Ned heard a soft tap at his chamber door. He opened it to find Ser Roderick, rain dripping from his cloak, face drawn. "My lord, they've found something," he said in a hushed voice. Ned glanced down the hall, ensuring no one watched. "Come in." Roderick entered, removing his sodden cloak. "They've tracked one of the conspirators to a warehouse near the east docks. They caught glimpses of men in cloaks moving crates in and out late at night. One of my men managed to slip inside and found those crates filled with weapons, spears, shields, crossbows, enough to arm a small army. He overheard talk about waiting for the right sign from across the narrow sea. And a name, Illyrio." Ned's heart thudded. "Illyrio Mopatus of Pentos, presumably. I know the name. He's rumored to have dealings with the Targaryen exiles. Roderick nodded grimly. Aye. Seems these men are stockpiling arms, perhaps for a time when Viserys Targaryen might land with sellswords. I cannot say how soon or how widespread their network is, but the presence of so many weapons is a bad sign. Ned raked a hand through his hair. Indeed, if we reveal this to Robert, he'll storm down there with the gold cloaks and start hanging men left and right. But if we do nothing, they may gather enough arms to ignite a real uprising. The city could bleed. Roderick hesitated. Jon Arryn wanted us to be discreet. Perhaps we can intercept the shipments or confiscate the arms quietly, so as not to alert everyone. Ned's mind raced. We must inform Lord Arryn at once. But we'll need a plan. If these are Targaryen loyalists, we might glean more by capturing their leader alive, or by letting the shipments continue until we find their higher contacts. He paused, rubbing his brow. We must do this carefully. Robert can't catch wind yet. I'll speak with the hand. Good work, Ser Roderick. Tell your men to stand by. Don't move on the warehouse until we have a directive. Roderick bowed. As you will, my lord. When Ned was alone, he paced the chamber, grappling with the revelation. The Targaryens were supposed to be scattered and powerless, with only Viserys and Daenerys rumored to remain. Yet if a wealthy Pentoshi magister like Illyrio truly supported them, that might change the game. Westeros was vast, and the seeds of rebellion could sprout anywhere, especially if they were watered with gold. Ned remembered the final days of Robert's rebellion all too well, the devastation, the fires. He would not see the realm plunged into another bloody conflict if he could help it. He forced himself to calm. Tomorrow he would speak to Jon Arryn, and together they would plan a response. For now he could do nothing more. Closing his eyes, he exhaled a slow breath. His thoughts turned to Jonel. If war came again, what fate for the boy, a child of both Stark and Lannister? Ned silently vowed to shield his son from any flames that might erupt. Duty demanded it, and fatherhood burned it into his core. But as the night pressed on, he realized that if the Targaryens truly had supporters in the city, the tenuous balance of power might shift unpredictably. Tywin Lannister could seize the moment to tighten his grip on the crown's finances. Robert's rage could spiral out of control, and in that chaos, men like Littlefinger or Varys would move their pieces, each with hidden ambitions. He thought of Cersei's earlier remark, "No one escapes the game forever." He glanced at the bed, where Cersei dozed with an arm draped over the empty space beside her. For a heartbeat, a wave of conflicting emotions surged in him. She was not the wife he had expected, but she was the wife he had, and they shared a child. They might yet find a way to preserve their family amid the storms gathering, or the winds of war and intrigue might tear them asunder. Ned made himself lie down, though sleep would not come easily. There were too many questions, too many dangers looming just beyond the torches of the Red Keep. And all the while, the capital's night wore on, cloaking the city's secrets in darkness, as though the black waters lapping at the foot of Aegon's high hill murmured of betrayals yet to be revealed. In the following days, Ned and Jon Arryn met in secret with Ser Roderick, planning a covert interception at the warehouse. The idea was to secure proof of Targaryen plotting before confronting the conspirators openly. At the same time, they needed to be sure their actions would not erupt into panic. Arryn even confided that he worried there might be other warehouses, other caches of weapons in other corners of the city, all tied to the same network. "We might only have found one of many," he said, voice grim. "Rooting them all out will require methodical caution." Ned agreed. "Then let us take the first step. If we can capture one of the leaders, we can interrogate him." They set a date for the raid. A moonless night, perfect for stealth. Jon Arryn arranged for a handful of trusted gold cloaks, men loyal to him personally, to assist. Roderick's men would lead them, having scouted the location thoroughly. Ned decided not to inform Cersei. He wanted to protect her from any blowback, especially if word of the raid reached Tywin or Robert prematurely. A part of him felt uneasy keeping secrets from her. It reminded him too much of the dynamic that had existed when they first wed. But he told himself it was for her safety. On the chosen night, Ned donned a plain cloak and joined Ser Roderick and 4 gold cloaks near the Red Keep's postern gate. They took a discreet path through the city, avoiding main thoroughfares, moving in small groups so as not to draw attention. A chill wind blew off Blackwater Bay, and the stench of rotting fish clung to the shadows of the dockside alleys. Rats scurried along the edges of half-flooded gutters. The warehouse in question was a squat, unremarkable structure of weathered boards and an old slate roof, nestled amid a row of similar buildings by the water. A single flicker of torchlight was visible through a gap in the boards. Roderick's men reported that a guard typically patrolled the perimeter, but the darkness hid him well. Ned crouched behind a stack of crates, signaling for the men to circle around. One of the gold cloaks carried a shortbow, ready to fire if the guard spotted them. The night air was tense with possibility. Ned's heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm. At a nod from Roderick, they moved. They found the guard easily enough. A wiry man with a torch, leaning against a post by the warehouse door, trying to keep warm. Before he could raise the alarm, one of Roderick's men pounced, clapping a hand over the guard's mouth and pulling him back into the darkness. The guard struggled briefly, but a hilt to the temple ended it. He slumped unconscious, dragged out of sight. Ned led the way to the door, which was barred from within. One of the gold cloaks produced a narrow pry bar, working it between the boards. After a moment of careful effort, the bar lifted enough for them to ease the door open silently. Inside, the torchlight flared. 2 more men were visible near a cluster of crates. They had swords at their belts. Ned signaled a quiet approach, but as they moved, one of the men turned, glimpsing a shape in the shadows. "Who goes?" he began, voice echoing. Roderick launched forward, smashing into the man with his shoulder. The other man drew steel. Ned had no choice but to rush in. He parried a wild swing, then knocked the blade aside and struck the hilt of his own sword against the man's head, trying to subdue rather than kill. The man dropped. The first guard managed a grunt of alarm, but a gold cloak silenced him. The interior of the warehouse was larger than Ned expected, stacked with crates that smelled of oiled metal. From deeper in the gloom, a shout arose. More men emerged, brandishing weapons. A wild melee ensued, the flicker of torches revealing half a dozen figures. Ned ducked a slash, disarmed one attacker, narrowly avoided a spear thrust from another. Roderick's men fought with disciplined skill, while the gold cloaks pressed in. Blades clanged against wooden crates, sending echoes that seemed to magnify the chaos. At one point, Ned glimpsed a man with a cloak trimmed in the silver and black of House Darklyn, an old house that had once supported the Targaryens. The man lunged at Ned with a dagger, hissing, "For the rightful king!" before Ned batted him aside. Finally, the scuffle ended. 4 of the conspirators lay senseless or wounded. 2 had fled into the night, vanishing out a back entrance. Ned cursed quietly that they hadn't been able to surround the place entirely. Still, they had taken prisoners and uncovered a trove of weaponry. By the torchlight, Ned pried open a crate to find crossbows stacked in neat rows, along with a bundle of small banners featuring the 3-headed dragon of Targaryen black on red. They were carefully rolled, apparently awaiting the day they would be unfurled. Heart hammering, Ned turned to one of the gold cloaks. "Bind these men. We need them alive." Roderick stepped up beside him, breathing hard. "We'll search the rest of the crates. See if there's any scrolls or letters we can use to trace their leaders." Ned nodded. "Do so, but be swift. We can't remain here long, or the city might stir." One of the wounded conspirators spat blood, sneering, "You traitors to the true king. He'll come, you'll see. Viserys will reclaim the throne that's his by right." His accent had a faint hint of the Crownlands, likely a local. Ned knelt beside him, brow darkening. "Viserys Targaryen is a beggar across the sea. You think bringing these weapons here will help him? All you've done is risk the peace." The man coughed. "Peace? With an usurper on the throne? There is no peace." Ned motioned for the gold cloaks to drag him off. "We'll see if your tune changes in the dungeons." In the gloom, Roderick's men found a small chest containing parchments. Lists of names, instructions for shipments, references to our friends in Pentos. Ned skimmed them, sickened by how extensive the network might be. This was more than a random group of malcontents. Someone with money and coordination was fueling the Targaryen cause from across the sea. At Roderick's direction, the gold cloaks loaded the confiscated weapons onto a covered cart. They would move the prisoners and the arms to a secure location under the Hand's authority. Dawn was not far off by the time the operation concluded. Ned returned to the Red Keep with his nerves frayed and the knowledge that a dangerous conspiracy lurked in the capital. Jon Arryn would want to interrogate the prisoners at once, hoping to extract names of any highborn lords involved. As Ned finally climbed into bed that morning, he found Cersei awake. She sat up, her hair spilling over her shoulders, her eyes flickering with curiosity. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "It's nearly dawn." He pressed a weary hand to his brow. "It was a matter of the hands, a delicate operation that needed my presence." She studied him in silence, green eyes keen. "Does it have something to do with the Targaryens?" Ned stiffened. He debated denying it, but one look at her face told him she was not ignorant. "A threat, yes. We uncovered a cache of arms. Loyalists plotting in the city." She let out a slow breath, as though absorbing the implications. "So the rumors were true. What will you do?" He shrugged off his cloak, carefully placing it aside. "We've taken prisoners. We'll learn more. Then Jon Arryn will decide how to proceed." Cersei nodded, biting her lower lip. For a moment, she looked almost uncertain, which was rare for her. "And will you tell Robert?" "When we must," Ned said. "Not yet, until we know the full extent. Telling him might provoke a purge we can't control." She exhaled. "Wise. He would tear the city apart, searching for traitors. My father, too, would demand blood to protect House Lannister's position." Ned sat on the bed's edge, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. "I want to protect the realm from more war, Cersei, and protect our son." She shifted closer, placing a hand on his back. The gesture felt oddly tender. "We share that goal," she murmured. "Jonel is at the heart of all this. If the realm descends into chaos, we cannot keep him safe. I will do whatever I must to protect him. You know that." He glanced at her, seeing a rare vulnerability behind those keen green eyes. This was not simply the proud lioness snarling at threats. This was a mother determined to shield her cub. He recalled the day in the God's Wood at Winterfell, when they prayed over the newborn child. That fierce devotion had been clear even then. He placed a hand over hers. "Then we stand together on this." She gave a single nod, an unspoken accord passing between them. In that quiet dawn, with the first pale light seeping through the shuttered windows, they sat side by side, bound more firmly than ever by the knowledge that enemies moved in darkness, and that to protect their child, they would have to navigate a game of cunning and caution. Outside, the city awakened, oblivious to the conspirators who had just been dragged to secret cells. The gulls cried over the harbor. The cycle of daily life churned on. Fishmongers hawking their wares, bakers kneading dough, lords and knights waking for another day of pomp and posturing. But Ned Stark and Cersei Lannister Stark sensed that the path ahead would only grow more perilous. In the weeks that followed, Jon Arryn quietly interrogated the prisoners in the Red Keep's dungeons. The Loyalists were a mixed lot, some former retainers of houses that had once supported the Targaryens, others mere sellswords who'd been paid well to smuggle weapons. A few were lower-born men enthralled by the legend of the Dragon Kings. Under careful questioning, they revealed that shipments had been arriving for nearly half a year, stored in various safe houses. The conspirators planned to wait until word came that Viserys Targaryen had secured an alliance with a powerful magister or warlord across the sea. Then, when the time was ripe, they would distribute arms and incite riots in King's Landing, hoping to create an uprising that would aid a Targaryen landing. Jon Arryn was resolute in ensuring the plot was unraveled, but equally resolute in keeping it hidden from Robert. He feared the king's reaction more than he feared the conspirators themselves. Robert would demand heads, starting with anyone remotely linked to the Targaryens, Arryn confided to Ned. that might push other lords into the rebel camp out of fear or resentment. We must be precise. Like a surgeon cutting out a tumor, they orchestrated a series of small raids, capturing more warehouses of weapons. Some conspirators vanished as rumors of an investigation spread through the underworld. Still, enough were taken to hamper the plot significantly. The hush money that had been funneling in from Pentos was seized, or at least partially intercepted. Ned believed they had dealt the conspiracy a serious blow, though he suspected a few ringleaders might yet remain at large. Cersei was content to let Ned handle these matters, focusing on courtly affairs and on ensuring Jonal's continued well-being. Tywin Lannister, away in the west, was left unaware of the scale of the Targaryen threat, which suited Jon Arryn's plan. Even Jaime Lannister seemed unconcerned, too busy with his Kingsguard duties and the occasional feast. Robert, for his part, continued in blissful ignorance, planning another grand hunt in the Kingswood. Yet the uneasy sense that a second rebellion had nearly sparked in the capital lingered in Ned's mind. He could not forget that the Targaryen exiles were out there, and that some in Westeros still yearned for the return of dragonlords. He worried what might happen if Viserys found a powerful benefactor in Essos, or if Daenerys formed some alliance of her own. The realm could be plunged into war once again. Winter might come, both literally and figuratively, bringing dire consequences. As the months drifted on, Jonal reached his 5th name day, and the boy insisted on having a small training sword of his own. Ned relented only grudgingly, under the condition that Jonal practice under close supervision from Ser Aaron Santagar or one of Ned's trusted northern knights. The child took to the yard with an enthusiasm that made Ned's heart both swell with pride and twist with fear. Cersei watched their son's first, clumsy attempts with the wooden blade, her face unreadable, though Ned caught a flicker of worry in her eyes. Neither parent wanted Jonal truly drawn into warfare, but they both recognized that in the world they occupied, a noble son needed some skill at arms or risk being vulnerable. Yet for every moment of paternal worry, there were simpler joys. Jonal sometimes came racing into Ned's solar, breathless with excitement, babbling about a new cat he'd seen or a story a minstrel told. The child's laughter was a bright thread in the tapestry of the Red Keep's gloom. He charmed many of the courtiers, who found him polite yet spirited, a child who could recite the names of all the Stark kings in the north as well as he could identify the sigil of House Lannister. Indeed, Jonal's dual heritage intrigued many. Some saw it as the promise of unity, while others silently wondered if the boy would grow to favor the north or the west. Even Peter Baelish's jests about future heirs lost some of their sting as Jonal's presence became an everyday fact of court life. Cersei remained somewhat distant from Ned in private, but they maintained a working partnership, consulting each other whenever the king's swirling intrigues touched upon their house. She was quick to bring him any new rumor that might threaten them, be it a whisper of Baelish's machinations or a rumor that Robert might name a new master of laws if Renly took a post elsewhere. Meanwhile, Ned shared with her select details of his own concerns, such as the Targaryen threat, though he refrained from burdening her with the full scope of Jon Arryn's investigations. Trust between them existed, but in me, Asser dozes. On a crisp day late in the year, word reached King's Landing of a disturbance in the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy had apparently refused to send tribute for the next royal feast, citing the crown's heavy-handed demands. The tension there was growing. Robert, half-drunk at a midday meal, laughed off any concern. "Let the Krakens posture," he said. "If they stir up trouble, I'll crush them again. That old fool Balon knows better than to challenge the Iron Throne." Ned was not so sure. He remembered the Ironborn's fierce independence, their yearning to return to the old way of raiding. If they tested the new king's patience, war might erupt. Another conflagration was the last thing Westeros needed, especially with Targaryen loyalists lurking in the shadows. Ned pressed Robert to negotiate, but the king merely waved a hand. "They'll come to heel or they'll die. Simple as that, Ned." Jon Arryn and Ned exchanged worried glances behind Robert's back, knowing the king's bluster often masked a refusal to see danger until it was at the gates. Cersei, too, showed concern. She told Ned one evening, "My father always said that controlling the seas is as vital as controlling the land. If the Greyjoys disrupt trade or ally with some foreign power, the entire realm could suffer. "Tell your father to speak with Robert, then," Ned said. "Robert might heed Tywin's counsel on finances if not on strategy." Cersei's lips pressed thin. "He might, but persuading father to intervene is another matter. He has no love for the Ironborn. He might prefer to let them rebel and then crush them, thus proving the might of House Lannister and the crown. My father has a mind for grand gestures." Ned sighed, recalling how Tywin had ended the reign of the Targaryens by sacking King's Landing at the most opportune time. Indeed, Tywin's approach to warfare was cold, precise, and ruthless. If war erupted with the Iron Islands, Tywin would likely see advantage in it, perhaps demanding new concessions or consolidating more power at court in the aftermath. Days passed, then weeks, the threat of Ironborn revolt hanging in the air but not yet exploding into open conflict. The tension in the capital mounted, aggravated by the usual swirl of petty rivalries. Ned found himself longing for the north again, for the quiet dignity of Winterfell's halls. But with Jonel growing and with Cersei's place at court so embedded, returning permanently seemed impossible. One evening, Ned decided to take Jonel to the Godswood in the Red Keep. Though it was nothing like Winterfell's ancient grove, there was still a weirwood tree in the corner of the gardens, transplanted centuries ago. The trunk was slender, the face carved crudely, but it retained a faint sense of the old god's presence. Ned knew Jonel had never truly experienced a northern Godswood, so he wanted to share at least a fragment of that tradition. They arrived at twilight, the sky streaked with purple and gold. Jonel clutched his father's hand, looking around curiously. "Papa, it's quiet here." Ned knelt beside the boy. "A Godswood is meant to be quiet, so you can listen to the old gods. In Winterfell, the weirwood has a much older face, bigger branches. Someday, I'll take you there again." Jonel's eyes lit up. "I remember a little, but I was small." He reached out to touch the trunk of the slender tree. "Does it talk?" Ned smiled softly. "It listens more than it speaks." Jonel gave a solemn nod, then glanced at the carved face. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm Jonel. Please keep my papa and mama safe." Ned felt a tug at his heart. He closed his eyes, placing a hand on the wood, and murmured his own prayer. To protect his son, to guide him through a world of uncertain loyalties. The hush of the gods would envelop them. For a moment, father and son stood together, bound by the intangible presence of the old gods, forging a memory that might sustain them in the trials yet to come. When they emerged, the corridors had grown dark, and torches flickered against the walls. Jonel chattered excitedly about the tree, asking if it could see them all the time. Ned answered patiently, grateful for the child's curiosity. They headed back toward the family chambers, guided by a pair of guards. Cersei was there waiting, arms folded, concern on her face. "I wondered where you two had gone." Ned gently prodded Jonel's back. "We visited the Godswood." The boy beamed. "It's pretty, Mama. There's a tree with a face. Papa says it's the old gods, from the north." Cersei's gaze flicked to Ned, her lips curving in a faint smile. "So he's to know the old gods as well as the seven, is he?" "He carries northern blood," Ned said simply. "He should understand that heritage." She nodded, then reached to smooth Jonel's hair. "Very well. If it makes him happy, I won't deny him." She lowered her hand, looking thoughtful. "Dinner is nearly ready. Let's eat, and you can tell me more about this face in the tree." Jonel bounced on his toes, eager to share his impressions. Cersei guided him away, and Ned followed, reflecting on how a small, simple ritual could bring a sense of comfort amid the storm of politics. He only wished the realm's troubles were as easily soothed. The next few moons passed without the outbreak of war, though tension with the Iron Islands remained. Word from across the sea hinted that Viserys Targaryen still wandered Essos, seeking alliances, while Daenerys remained hidden or possibly betrothed to some Dothraki horse lord, depending on which rumor one believed. King Robert refused to focus on such matters, trusting that any threat from the Targaryens was too distant to matter. Jon Arryn and Ned Stark, knowing the truth of the conspiracy they had foiled, remained vigilant. Yet the trails they followed led to no further revelations. Many of the exiled conspirators had fled the city. By Jon's 6th year, Ned and Cersei's marriage had settled into a curious equilibrium. They were not lovers in the passionate sense, but they were partners in a shared goal, ensuring their son's future and upholding the realm's stability. Cersei managed the court's social sphere with a deft hand, forging alliances that kept them both in good standing. Ned oversaw justice and governance alongside Jon Arryn, ensuring northern interests were not trampled. Robert aged into a somewhat heavier man, prone to drink and feasting, but still as loud and boisterous as ever. Jaime Lannister served faithfully in the Kingsguard, though Ned sometimes caught a shadow in his eyes, perhaps regret or resentment, it was hard to tell. Tywin Lannister made visits to King's Landing, each time surveying the scene with cool appraisal, seemingly satisfied that his daughter and grandson were well established. To outward appearances, House Stark and House Lannister remained united by the child whose hair was dark as midnight but whose eyes shone green as emeralds. Jon grew tall and lean, developing a keen intelligence that showed in his questions about the realm's history. He would run to Ned with a wooden sword, demanding lessons in swordsmanship, and then to Cersei with demands to be read stories of old heroes. If ever two natures lived in one child, it was Jon Stark Lannister, and Ned prayed that the realm would never test him in the brutal ways it had tested so many children before. But Westeros was a land of shifting storms, and no calm could last forever. On the horizon, the unhealed wounds of Robert's rebellion, the simmering resentment of Dorne, the unsettled ambition of the Greyjoys, and the exiled Targaryens in Essos loomed like thunderclouds. Ned sensed that one day, perhaps sooner than any expected, the realm would again face the roar of conflict. And when it did, the loyalties of a single child, born of the wolf and the lion, might matter more than anyone could foresee. That knowledge, both sobering and profound, guided him each day as he strove to shield Jon from the worst of King's Landing's intrigues. Some nights, he would stand at the balcony overlooking the yard where his son had played and wonder if Cersei did the same from her vantage point, each of them silently praying for the same thing. Let this child be spared. Let him outgrow our sins. Let him weave a new story. For in the shifting tapestry of Westeros, threads of hope were rare, and once unraveled, they were nearly impossible to mend. Thus Eddard Stark and Cersei Lannister Stark continued forward together, awkward allies, guarded confidants, and co-parents determined to see their son stand strong in a realm where the slightest tilt of power could shake the foundations of thrones. If that meant forging a bond stronger than the sum of their differences, then so be it. In the hush of night, they each whispered silent vows to protect Jon from the storms to come, for the sake of peace, honor, and the glimmer of a better future that sparkled, however precariously, in their child's bright green eyes.